My name is John Sanfey. My background is medicine. I've been a doctor here in the National Health Service in the UK for 35 years. My interest in consciousness goes back to the 1990s, and the idea I'm presenting today had its origin in earlier versions going back to the Quantum Mind conference in Flagstaff in Arizona in 1999. I've presented similar versions or later versions in various TSC conferences and others over the years since. The basic idea is that time is the key to developing physical laws of consciousness, that the hard problem is actually a visual illusion caused by having a spatial interpretation, a spatial understanding of the problem of consciousness. What I'll be doing is spending the first part of the talk looking at Schopenhauer, who lived about 200 years ago, an Austrian philosopher. His work has largely been overlooked and is not talked about much in terms of consciousness today, but actually he came very close to solving the hard problem. And the particular problem that tripped him up provides a vital clue, I think, which we need today. Schopenhauer had a very sophisticated understanding of causality and was a major influence on Einstein and others, Schrödinger, for example. Einstein famously had 3 portraits on the wall of his study when he was doing his early work, and one of them was Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer was driven into panpsychism, and for that reason, we're going to look more closely at the reason why. But first, let's understand the problem, the hard problem, and it really comes down to an incompatibility between two concepts: causality and supervenience. Causality can be described in these terms. Everything observable should have a physical cause. A can be said to cause B when complete knowledge of A is sufficient to predict B, and vice versa, because in physics, the laws of physics appear to be time reversible. But of course, empirically, when A is in the past of B, when A causes B, A must be in the past of B. And this is true in quantum mechanics as well as classical physics. When state A is known to have existed and causes state B, it must be in the past of B. The concept of supervenience can be described as it's not possible to have any difference in properties without a corresponding physical difference. And the reason this causes problems for consciousness, causes the hard problem, is that it is the level of physical change where causality operates. So changes in mental properties must have corresponding physical properties, and it is those physical properties where causality operates. This leaves consciousness as an epiphenomenon with no causal, no root, no explanation for how it could cause physical change in the observable world. So to understand the trap that Schopenhauer found himself in, you need to see the context. And that goes down back to Berkeley, George Berkeley, in the early 1700s, whose work showed that solipsism cannot be proven false. It's simply impossible empirically or logically to prove beyond doubt the world is not an illusion of one's own mind. Kant took this problem seriously and developed a philosophy which he called transcendental idealism. And this is the view that there are unknowable aspects of matter, the essential properties of matter. The phenomenal world is actually a joint construct between mind and a presumptive physical substrate or manifold that we believe to exist, but which is unknowable. For Kant, the mind contributed space, time, and 12 categories of understanding, one of which was causality. Schopenhauer tidied this up. Schopenhauer was highly critical of Kant for confusing conceptualization from the brute phenomenon of experience. And he eliminated from the philosophy 11 of the 12 categories of understanding, leaving only causality along with space and time as being necessary components of mind. This was an important advance. It tidied up the understanding of consciousness and made it something distinct from conceptual abstract thought. So to Schopenhauer, matter was the operation of causality. And this idea required a unification of space and time. And that was quite an advanced concept 100 years before relativity theory. Matter is knowable to Schopenhauer, is knowable as the representation of causation, but mind is the subjective correlate of causality. So the question rises, if mind is subjectively correlated with the phenomenal world of cause and effect, why was he a panpsychist? Surely there's a toehold in that concept to develop a way of explaining consciousness as having causal efficacy in the world. Well, the problem is that we can see by looking at the trap a bit more closely, the causally closed world of phenomenon is a continuum, and within that continuum of change, the noumenon, or the inner essence of matter, makes no difference to the causally closed world of change. The noumenon has to be construed as an undifferentiated constancy underpinning matter and underpinning all the fundamental forces. It's a constancy throughout nature. Change only occurs in the causally closed continuum, of which time is a part, and the change is continuous. So the problem for consciousness, and here I've introduced the term AR, which is simply to describe the idea that in a continuum of change, every moment of time must have some conceptual representation of the past, of the immediate past. So the concept of immediate memory being retained in relation to something, a future that it has caused. So the world as representation, ARB, in which the immediate past is related to the future it has caused in a continuum of motion. In this world of representation, mind and matter are inseparable within phenomenal reality. Kant and Schopenhauer both would have agreed with that statement. The problem is, of course, that there's no place for consciousness there. ARB can be delivered by unconscious mechanisms, which Schopenhauer understood. The world as representation is actually the world as unconscious representation. It's delivered into conscious perception, which means the conscious observer has no place to be, no place to reside, except in this visual understanding of visual concept of reality. The conscious observer has nowhere to be other than in the hidden part of matter, the visually hidden part of matter, namely the noumenon, which of course means that it has no causal efficacy, because the noumenon is a constancy within nature. It makes no moment-to-moment changes in the phenomenal world of cause and effect. So the world is Schopenhauer's famous book was The World as Will and Representation, but it's actually the world as unconscious representation. And the subjectivity of consciousness resides in the inner substance of brain matter, where it is a constancy with no moment-to-moment influence on the phenomenal world. It's an epiphenomenon. So that's the problem. And this idea that the world is delivered by unconscious mechanisms into consciousness actually is the seed for a solution, a time-based solution to the problem of consciousness. So let's go back to Berkeley, because that's how this line of thought developed. How do we know that solipsism cannot be proven false? The problem is that percepts look identical in both concepts. They can either be the product of unconscious perception, or they can be independently physically real. but there's no detectable difference between the two. Representation, the percept, A or B, looks identical to solipsis and the realist. There's no spatially observable difference. And A or B, it represents the totality of observable phenomenal world, the world of science, world of cause and effect. However, only a conscious observer, only a conscious presence can know that there is no observable difference, that there are two options with no spatially observable difference. An external system simply cannot see a difference between conscious and unconscious processes or perception, which of course is the nature of the hard problem. So how does consciousness know what information is available? Well, consciousness knows two things that are undetectable by anything outside a particular moment of consciousness. Firstly, it knows it exists. This goes back to Nagel in 1974 in his famous paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" We only know, we can only define consciousness by appealing to each individual's experience of being conscious. We simply don't know for certain that somebody else is conscious. Cause and effect could be sufficient to explain everything about someone else's behavior. That's the nature of the hard problem. But we know our consciousness exists, it's a phenomenon, it's real. We also know that it has not caused percepts. In other words, we know that we cannot at will change something blue into red. We can't turn an elephant into a mouse. These are delivered into conscious awareness, into our presence, into the presence of consciousness by unconscious systems. So conscious presence is able to detect difference that has no spatial difference. And the question then becomes, what is the information of presence? What is presence? Well, we know that for both the realist and the solipsist, something is happening, and that is absolutely certain. But it's happening and it's changing. That change is empirically certain. So somehow, presence is inside change. It's a reference frame for change. In fact, there are two ways we know this to be true. We experience change for certain. We are inside change. We exist in relation to change. But we also know that the concept of any difference, any change, requires a relationship to non-change, non-difference. There must be a frame of reference in relation to change, and we know this in two ways: logically and experientially. And it's within this framework, from the perspective of this framework, this reference frame, that solipsism, a choice of interpretation, choice of meaning, exists despite no observable difference of meaning. So I think we can say that we've deduced, and I think it is deduction, that there's a conceptual limit where only the experience of being in time is certain, where there is a difference from nothing that has no spatial dimension. And that's the nub of my argument, that the innerness of being, the innerness of conscious presence, is unique, is specifically temporal. That there's an experience of being where only there's a limit where only the experience of being in time is certain, and there is no difference from nothing with a spatial dimension. Sorry, there is a difference from nothing with no spatial dimension. So conceptually, how do we describe this? How do we bridge mind and matter? How do we explain consciousness, the role of consciousness within science? Well, we know that consciousness exists. Well, if the deductions above are true, consciousness in brains is conceptually the same as time within clocks, in the sense that we exist in the world as representation. The representation is in the language of the senses. It's in the language of sounds, colors, touch, textures, etc., smells. In exactly the same conceptual sense that time is inside clocks that measure change. Both are abstract, both look abstract, and both are conceptually abstract. The big difference, of course, two big differences between this understanding of consciousness, this concept of consciousness, and the concept of time, is that we know consciousness is real because we experience it. Time, on the other hand, is always abstract. Consciousness looks abstract, and conceptually it must be described in abstract terms, but we know it is real. Second big difference ontologically between describing being or describing consciousness in terms of as conceptually identical to time. Second difference is that we see change. We experience difference where there is no spatial difference. I call this idea abstract realism, and it's described in more detail in the paper that accompanies this talk, which I can make available. I'm happy to make available to anybody who contacts me. My contact details will be provided at the end. So the idea is that the epistemic reference frame for change, it looks abstract, that a consciousness is invisible, spatially invisible, but actually it's an epistemic framework. We must deduce that it is an epistemic framework that is able to attribute meaning to differences where there is no spatial difference, to attribute difference where there is no observable difference. And this has empirically testable consequences. The privacy of consciousness creates uncertainty. It's the uncertainty that we experience can alter the pace of neural patterns. This is a prediction of the ideas that, sorry, I'll just alter this. This is a prediction of the ideas here. The pace of interaction between feed-forward signals and feedback signals in the brain is altered by the experience of consciousness. The brain can generate 100 billion bits of information per second, and this slight change of pace over a couple of seconds, as pause of uncertainty, is sufficient to generate a lot of information, a lot of new perspectives, a lot of new pieces of information within the brain, and that's the purpose of consciousness. I've discussed this is discussed a little bit in more detail in the paper. So these ideas can be falsified, and this neural pace, if you like, is a supporting piece of information. But the idea would be falsified if conscious meaning or choice resulting from meaning can be predicted by a Libet-style experiment. So, in summary, well, the hard problem is a visual illusion caused by falsely having a spatial concept of presence, and whereas it should be a temporal. There is a limit at which being is purely temporal, a conceptual limit where there is no spatial difference, and yet consciousness experiences a difference. And this can only be conceptualized as a difference in time, being, non-being, then, now, or perhaps more worryingly, now, next. So metaphysically, all duality is an illusion. Looking at any difference, any pairing, requires a reference framework which will look abstract, it will look invisible, and conceptually it must be described as an abstract epistemic system which contains options of meaning. Trinity is a more fundamental concept than duality, metaphysically, if these arguments are true. There's a conceptual limit where being has no spatial dimension. So some of the concepts, earlier concepts that were part of this development, of the evolution of this idea, are important when it comes to relating subjectivity to physics. In the future, obviously work to be done. There's no now in physical time. percepts exist in the language of perception, in colors, textures, etc. And the past and future aspects of those percepts are held together by, in immediate experience, they're held together by the mind, by the relational framework. They're held together to create now. But this has equivalent systems within physics. In physics, we have the equivalence of nowness, where infinite series equations was it took some 2,000 years to develop this solution to Zeno's paradoxes of motion. Zeno's paradoxes, of course, relate to the infinite divisibility of intervals of continuous time. Calculus fields is an interesting idea, because the concept of fields is that we imagine properties, functions that are superimposed on space to describe the behavior of entities through moments of time. So these are equivalent ideas and equivalent abstract concepts in physics. The basic idea is that there is a conceptual relationship between subjectivity and physics through the equivalence, these artificial instruments, artificial systems for that are equivalent to now. They create nowness in physics. They relate the past and the future. They narrate the past and the future in the way that we narrate past and future in the language of sensory perception. So these ideas are falsifiable, they're testable, and I believe there's a biologically plausible explanation for them. And that's all dealt with in a little bit more detail in the paper, which, as I said, I'm very happy to send to anybody. It's not a huge, big paper, it's 9,000 words, but I'd be more than happy, delighted to continue this conversation. Just a quick look at the paper for further information. It's the same email address, johnsanfey@mac.com. The paper is called Perception and the Continuum. It's just finished and about to be submitted for hopeful publication. So I'm available online following this talk for whatever few minutes we have left. So please, thank you for listening, and I'll read your questions.
Hello, my name is Francoise Tibika. I work at the Institute of Chemistry of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and I am also affiliated with the New Israel Institute of Science and Consciousness. And I am here today to talk to you about time. And it is the right time now to thank the organizer for having given me this great opportunity to come here and present my work. I am very, very thankful. So what is time? Time is a word that is being used nearly every day on different contexts. Time passes fast, time passes slow, time stands still, I have time, I have no time, I take my time, etc., etc. And it has been the subject of debates for many, many, many years, you know, since maybe the start of our civilization. And it is a subject of many books, philosophers, thinkers, psychologists, and also science has to say something about it. And one would think that science, which has a very simple language, universal language, is very assessed on time, but I want to show here that even in science, time is the word that might describe the different phenomenon, and this is what I would like to share with you today. So let's start and agree on one time, which I call the cosmic time. And the cosmic time is actually the time with which we measure time. Here, what we have taken as a measure of our time is the number of rotation of the Earth around its axis. And we have decided that one rotation would be 24 hours. So here time is connected to a number of movement, a regular movement that is repeating itself, and we call it time. And as I just said, one rotation of the Earth is 24 hours. But so time is a ruler with which we measure a phenomenon, and I think that this is the confusion, that with the same ruler we have measured different phenomenon, exactly as with weight you can measure diamonds and you can measure potatoes. So here we have devices that are following, for instance, the sand clock is following the rotation of the Earth around its axis. And then we have invented clocks which are also following this rotation. But we could have used a sand clock to measure time. And just if we had a robot to turn it each time, so we could have measured time by the number of rotation of this sand clock. So let's try and try to understand what I call the difference in time. So first we're going to start with the time of physics. So the time of physics has been introduced into an equation by Galileo Galilei when he started to observe the laws of motion, and it has been enlarged later on 1 century after, more or less, by Isaac Newton. And what this time says, this time is actually a duration of a motion in space. When we have a body in space, we need 3 coordinates to locate its right position, and these are notated here. But when this body is starting to move, then we need another coordinate to follow its position and locate it at any point in space and time. And so at this point we can see that this time is a mathematical tool, because it can be positive, it can be negative. It has helped us to go to send a spaceship to the sky, but in fact it is just a mathematical tool, and it describes a very mechanistic world, meaning that if I know the position of a body, and if I know the forces that are acting on his body, I can say very easily when this body will be in the future or when it was in the past. So it is a totally deterministic time, if I can say. And of course, we cannot leave this time of physics without talking about Einstein. And Einstein, what he said that time is relative. What we thought was absolute is just relative. It means that if I measure time with a ruler, and then I change my perspective and I am looking at a very, very, very fast object, then I see that its ruler is different than mine. His time is much larger, his seconds are longer. So Einstein really said that we are living not in a space that is different from time, but we are, since Einstein, we know that space and time are linked together. And when we move fast in time, we move slower in space, and inversely. But what actually, so time is really connected to velocity, the velocity difference between the observer and the observed phenomenon. And time is also connected to gravity. It seems, it doesn't seem, but it has been found that gravity is, the more an object is subjected to gravity, and the slower its time is. So if we stay in this context, I have a little slide here which are a kind of reflection about this time of the observer and the observed, because what is the speed of the observed? Is it, what can I see other that my senses are grasping, and all my senses are grasping are photons from outside, and my body is making a picture. So what I see from the observer is the light that he reflects. It is the sound that I can hear, and the molecules that I touching myself. So the speed of the observed is not uniform. And if I look at the observer, where is the observer? Is it my body at rest? Is it in my molecules? Is it in my nerve impulses? Is it in my imagination? What is the speed of this observer? But this question I want to leave open, you know, for your imagination, and I want to switch to another time which I think is very crucial, and it is the second time of science, and it is the time of becoming. And I use this term in memory of Ilya Prigozhin. And the time of becoming is not the time of a duration of a motion in space, but it is a time of the duration of a chemical transformation. And chemical transformation, as you see here, I take 2 eggs and I cook them, or I take a piece of wood and I burn it, and this time is leaving traces, and it leaves irreversible transformation. And why do I think that this time is different? Because this time is acting, it is a time of molecules, and molecules are so small and so light that they don't feel gravitation. They are not subjected to gravitation, but to another force which is very, very dominant at their scale, and this is the electromagnetic force. This is a force that is acting between protons and electrons within an atom, or between atoms, within neighboring atoms, and this force is not only attractive like gravitation, but it is also repulsive, and it is the charge distribution that dictates this chemical transformation. It is not gravity and it is not velocity. Therefore, I think this time is totally different, and even more, this time carries information. So this time of becoming is carrying an information. So let's talk about information. It is very weird to think that information can be measured or can be weighed when we think about all kinds of information there is around us. And this we owe to the brilliancy of this famous mathematician Claude Shannon, which was living last century, and he is actually the father of all our digital era. And Claude Shannon has this genius, this brilliant idea that information, to weigh information, you don't have to know the content of the information. All you need to know is the probability of it to happen. So, and he has succeeded to come up with a formula in order to measure the information, and this is the formula, and he has called its measure of information entropy. And what it is strange about entropy is that it is a word that has been used in thermodynamics by Ludwig Boltzmann, among others, 1 century ago. And what is even strange about this is that the formula that Ludwig Boltzmann has found for the entropy is quite similar, in very special case, to the entropy of Shannon. You see the similarity between the two equations, and for Boltzmann, entropy is a measure of disorder. So I don't want here to get into the details, but this disorder is connected to the probability of the energy distribution. I could tell more about it, but if there are questions, what is important here to remember is that with this similarity between the formula of Shannon for entropy, which is a measure of information, and the entropy of Boltzmann, which is a measure of disorder, actually we can reach a statement that scientists has started to work on, and it is that a chemical system actually is an information source, and this information, it concerns the distribution of the energy of the system. And a chemical reaction is a transfer of this information. And the time of becoming is a time necessary to carry this information. In the language of Shannon, when entropy increases or decreases, it means that information is decompressed or compressed. And in the Boltzmann language, when entropy increases or decreases, it means that disorder increases or decreases. And here is a time to remember that living beings are a system where entropy is locally decreased, which means that information is compressed. And indeed, living beings are specific compared to inert matter because they can compress information and make cells from different molecules. And cells are in itself a complicated chemical system that is gathering information from outside and even can replicate itself. So to conclude about the time of becoming, first of all, I forgot to say about Ilya Prigogine that he was a great chemist who worked on a far-form equilibrium system and has found a way to describe how life has come from inert matter. So he has found this term of time of becoming, and I would like to use it in his memory. So this time doesn't concern continuous motion in space-time, but it concerns a chaotic motion. It is not affected by gravitation, but it is submitted to electromagnetic force, which is totally different from gravitation. And this time of becoming, it concerns degradation of energy and information transfer. And of course, it is not subjected to causality because molecules have no past. They are so numerous that we cannot reconstruct the past and put all the molecules where they were in the past, or we have no idea where they will go in the future. So this time of becoming is totally out of causality. And of course, maybe you have recognized that this is our time. The time of becoming is our time. My time is not what is connected to the what. My time is a time that has started when I was born and that will stop when I will die. This is my time. And actually, the time of becoming is actually only, it occurs only in the present. My molecules do not move in the past or will not move in the future now. In this right moment, my molecules are moving. My body is breathing. My senses are open. It's not in the past. It's not in the future. So it's only here in the moment, in the present moment, that my molecules knows how to make a cell. They know how to transmit life. So this is really the moment which is ours. So what I would like you to think about is, at what time do we live? And the time we live in is the time where we focus our attention. We focus our attention on our biological information, which is connected to our sensations, or do we focus our attention in what we have in the brain, thoughts, images, which is most of the time they are dealing with something that is past, and we really don't know what was the past because we remember only a part of it, and of course we don't know what the future brings. So we are most of the time dealing with fiction instead of being here present, and this moment where our body lives in the present and our mind is in another time, it brings stress. And the only solution to reduce this stress is to learn and to be here in the present, in the moment, because this is the only moment where life happens. And when we succeed to be into this moment, the present opens. You have a new dimension where you feel that you are somehow out of time. Maybe the observer is melting with the observed and you feel out of time. And I think this is the place where I would have liked to take you. You can reach it through meditation, but it is not the only way. And I think that all of us has to learn how to get into this wonderful place, which is called a present, because this is the only place where you can really connect it to yourself. And by connecting to yourself, by making this bridge between our mind and our body, we can all connect it to the others and maybe bring a different humanity. This is my last slide with the book I wrote on molecular consciousness and my address, and I thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Justin Riddle. I'm a postdoc at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the scientific director of the Carolina Center for Neurostimulation. And today I'll be talking about nested observer windows, a theory of scale-free cognition. And first I'd like to mention my co-authors, Jonathan Schooler at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Sean Ergin-Gioro at Northwestern University. All right, so we are proposing what's called the nested observer window model, or the NOW model. And essentially this model was created in order to address a problem with spatiotemporal scale. And so to summarize this problem, the idea is that there are many different disciplines which have all found compelling and novel discoveries related to the study of cognition and behavior. But one of the difficulties or challenges is that they each have studied very different biological systems. And they've all found meaningful things, but the question is, how do these scales actually interact with each other? And are there sort of general principles that can unify future research in order to sort of build common ground? And so in the NOW model, we're proposing that there are three basic principles which can help move us into more interdisciplinary study. So the first principle is coherence, and this is the formation of an observer window. And an observer window is the basic unit of information integration in the brain. Second, there is synchrony, and this is the synchronization of the activity between multiple observer windows, and this happens within a fixed spatiotemporal scale. So multiple observer windows at the same scale are able to share information by synchrony. And then third and finally is cross-frequency coupling, and this is a means by which multiple spatiotemporal scales can interact, where observer windows will orchestrate their activity to either share information in a bottom-up or top-down form between nested observer windows. So at a glance, the entire model depicted in a simple graph is essentially that there are observer windows here displayed as ovals, and these observer windows are established by coherence, and they have a refresh rate which is dependent on their spatiotemporal scale. So more macroscopic, slower, larger windows will have a certain refresh rate that's relatively faster than an observer window at a much smaller spatiotemporal scale. And then between observer windows, we have synchrony depicted here as a sine wave. And this is how observer windows within a fixed spatiotemporal scale will coordinate or share information laterally. And then finally, cross-frequency coupling is a means by which slower, larger systems can communicate information downward towards faster and smaller observer windows, or in a bottom-up fashion from the smaller, faster observer windows into the larger, slower observer windows. The observer windows that we're proposing here are proteins, neurons, and brain nuclei. And this is sort of our first pass at what we think these observer windows might look like, because there's sort of strong evidence for at least these three different units of information integration. And so one of the defining characteristics is coherence, and that essentially means that there must be a barrier between the observer window and the environment. So here, proteins, neurons, and nuclei all have sort of biological infrastructure in order to establish a strongly coupled, internally coherent system, which will have some sort of rhythmic processing associated with it and a sort of time signature of its activity. And we propose that these observer windows are integrating information. So they're opening a window upon which information is integrated. That window is closed and then refreshed into a new observer window to accumulate fresh information. And we speculate that these observer windows have some form of phenomenal experience associated with them. And at the end of the talk, I'll go into some implications for subjective experience. All right, so one example to illustrate the observer window in action in the brain nuclei comes from an experiment that discovers what's called the flicker fusion rate. So in this experiment, a participant is exposed to flashes of light. And if two flashes of light occur within a small enough time frame, there's this illusion of an experience that the two flashes are indeed just a single flash. The two flashes have been fused together versus the veridical experience that there are actually two separate flashes and that they are flickering one and then the other. And so research has shown that the visual cortex has been predictive of this flicker fusion rate. So participants who will have a faster neural oscillation in the visual cortex, they hover around 10 hertz and are called the alpha oscillation. But if you're slightly faster, around 12 hertz, then chances are that your observer windows are much smaller. And so then different lights will end up in different windows and be perceived as separate flashes. However, if you have a slower alpha rhythm around like 8 hertz, let's say, then your observer windows are slightly larger, and it's more likely that these flashes will end up within a single observer window and become integrated into a single perception. The flicker fusion rate highlights a trend in modern cognitive neuroscience that essentially a lot of cognition and perception is now understood to be not a continuous process, but instead more of a discrete process. So while we have sort of the naive experience of a continuous reality and a continuous visual experience, in fact, our neural systems and a lot of our perception is actually flickering in a sort of rhythmic refresh of discrete images as opposed to a more continuous movie, if you will. So we can gain a lot of this insight from optical illusions where our naive perception of reality seems to break down. So if you look here at this blue dot in the center, you'll see this illusory experience of flickering light at the center of this radiating circle on the right-hand side of the screen. And essentially what this illustrates is that your brain and your visual perception is oscillating. And this illusion has actually been also linked to the alpha oscillation in visual cortex, where you may be getting some sort of meta-awareness of this flickering, flashing of your visual cortex. And so this illusion really highlights what it is to be an observer window, in that there are sort of discrete moments of processing of information, and that information is integrated and then refreshed, and a new observer window is created. Okay, moving on to our next principle is synchrony. So to sort of differentiate synchrony from coherence, we like to use this analogy to conversation. So when two humans are having a conversation, if the conversation is going well, you will say that the two are in sync with each other. You know, one person is talking, the other one listens, the roles are then reversed, and there's a sharing of information between the two individuals. However, this does not contradict the individual's internal coherence or their own independence. So we don't say that the two individuals are fused into a single individual, but instead they maintain their autonomy and they are sharing information laterally with each other. So this is what it means to have two observer windows in sync. When brain nuclei are synchronized, they are facilitating their information sharing, or two neurons. However, the two neurons are not fusing into a single neuron, and the brain nuclei are not fusing into a single brain nuclei, but they're maintaining their independence and then communicating. So this has been shown in a variety of experiments, often under the framing of functional connectivity. But just to highlight sort of a simple toy example of this, let's say there's three regions in the brain: intraparietal sulcus in red, the lateral occipital cortex in yellow, and then the primary visual cortex in blue. And in this task, you're presented with four colors on the screen and told to attend a location. And for simplicity, let's say that IPS processes location and lateral occipital processes color. And so in the scenario where you would like to attend to location, it's been observed that these regions, here the primary visual and this spatially processing region, will synchronize their activity such that information is shared preferentially between IPS and V1, sort of at the expense of lateral occipital and V1 connectivity. And so this is an effective means by which the brain is dynamically able to sort of reallocate resources, and information can sort of flow dynamically between regions, given their moment-to-moment synchronization. And this has been shown in a variety of experiments. I'll highlight one that I found really compelling. And this is essentially a study where they presented visual and auditory information to participants in a flickering fashion. And the auditory and the video were presented in synchrony, or they were presented out of sync, and they were presented at multiple frequencies. And what was found was that memory for the audio-visual pairing was facilitated, one, when they were presented in phase with each other in synchrony, and two, they were facilitated when they were presented at a particular frequency important for memory consolidation, namely the theta frequency. So at theta frequency, in phase, visual and auditory regions of the brain were shown to synchronize their neural activity, and this facilitated subsequent memory for those items that were presented in this manner. And this highlights that the brain might really be sort of orchestrating these large-scale transfers of information between brain regions via specific carrier frequencies. And so one carrier frequency that seems to be very important to the brain is the theta frequency between 3 and 8 hertz. And some important sort of behavioral consequences of this profound rhythm in the human brain is that human language, seemingly across all cultures, has a very profound speech envelope in the theta frequency. So as I'm speaking to you right now, my words and language is being articulated with this profound theta speech envelope, and this sort of facilitates the information sharing with your auditory cortex and other regions of the brain in order to facilitate episodic memory consolidation, potentially. All right, on to the third and final principle of the now model is the cross-frequency coupling. And this is the fact that observer windows are nested. So every brain region is composed of neurons. Every neuron is composed of proteins. And so the question is there a way at which these different spatial temporal scales can actually communicate upwards and downwards between these different levels? And so some evidence for this comes from cross-frequency coupling, where here in blue you see the hippocampus resonating at a slower theta frequency oscillation. This is a important brain nuclei for memory. And then we have neurons, which are sort of refreshing or operating at a much faster frequency. And what evidence has shown is that there's cross-frequency coupling between the phase or these much slower oscillations in the hippocampus and the activity of these higher frequency neurons. So what's depicted here is called phase amplitude coupling, where the phase of where in the slower oscillation you are is predictive or coupled to the amplitude of the higher frequency activity of these neurons. And so we suggest that this is a important way by which information is sort of shared across these different scales. So to highlight what that might look like, the theta gamma neural code, as this is often been called in the context of the hippocampus with these particular rhythms, is very important for navigation. And so this was first discovered in the rat, where there were certain neurons which coded for different locations in space. And as the rat moved through a maze, it was shown that within a single theta cycle, or a single observer window of this slower brain nuclei of the hippocampus, there were sequences of neurons at a much higher frequency being activated. And the pattern of sequences was essentially encoding the trajectory of motion of the rat. So you'd see in this example, ABCD neurons firing in sequence, and this is being bound and integrated into a higher order, more abstract representation of motion. So it's not just 4 locations, but it's a motion or an ordering or a sequencing of these locations in the higher order observer window. And this has since been extended to a number of different cognitive domains. Here, just highlighting some recent work showing that sequences of items presented being bound into long-term memory are sort of being coordinated by theta gamma coupling. Now, a question is, does this occur sort of in the inverse direction, where you have, let's say, a decision-making task where some goal state being maintained or processed in a lower frequency system is influencing a lower order, higher frequency system? And some examples of this come from some of my own work, looking at delta beta coupling, where you have this low frequency delta oscillation in prefrontal cortex that couples to higher frequency activity in the beta frequency in motor cortex. And presumably this corresponds to a sort of top-down control signal from this higher order region, modulating and guiding these more lower order systems such as motor cortex, responsible for initiating actions. And so this lower order system is receptive to these top-down control signals and being modulated in this top-down direction. So what are the implications to subjective experience? So one idea is that human subjective experience is very slow. So as you go to swat at a fly, the fly can be seen to be darting around and sort of teleporting, if you will. And it's very difficult to swat this fly. And so the question is, why are humans so slow when it seems like a bad strategy from an evolutionary perspective to make things slower when you have these predator-prey relationships and you're more likely to get attacked if you're relatively slower? And so we would argue that the real saving grace of being a slower, larger system is that we're able to integrate more and more information. And so via this nested observer window framework, the higher order systems are given an increasingly more abstract and richer representation of the environment. So this is more accurate, more detailed, just more information overall, and more abstraction, sort of more sequencing and ordering of that reality. And similarly, another question is, why does it feel like we have such simple actions that we make? So when I choose to swat my hand through the air, my cognitive process around making that decision seems to be relatively simple. A very simple command of move my arm. I'm not quite aware of all of the neural activity going down my spinal cord into my arm, activating different muscles to move and extend and flex. So a lot of that detail gets masked out. And so one solution that the nested observer window model gives us is that potentially these slower, larger systems are not aware of the faster systems, but instead via cross-frequency coupling, they're able to give action commands, but not necessarily get bogged down in all the detail of these lower order systems. So they maintain some sort of autonomy between different levels in this biological hierarchy. And so one sort of repercussion of this, which has often been called a problem, and this is sort of the Cartesian theater problem posed by Daniel Dennett, is that if there is this little person in your head listening to the visual and the audio information, there must then be another person in that person's head and another person in that person's head, and there's sort of this infinite regression of not really getting at the bottom of what's going on. But we would propose that this is actually indeed sort of a homunculus solution where potentially the brain is able to dedicate sort of semi-autonomous regions or nuclei in the brain to process information within their own special lens of reality, if you will, and maintain some sort of autonomy from the rest of the brain, which might give rise to sort of these competing narratives or competing cognitive streams in the brain, and sort of a separation between different scales. And this might sort of give insight into our subjective experience. All right, so with that, I thank you for your attention. Feel free to reach out to me with questions, and thanks to all my collaborators.
Hello, my name is Ron Gruber. My colleagues are Rick Block, Montana State University, and Carlos Montemayor, San Francisco State University. And the topic is From Physical Time to a Dualistic Model of Human Time. I'll begin with defining the two times problem, and then introduce our dualistic model to solve it, which basically says the subjective components of human time perception have corresponding objective percepts of physical time. That includes a unique present, change, motion, temporality. And then I'll introduce some experiments that illustrate that if the subjective components are precluded, the perceived universe, A, is unesthetic but functional, B, resembles that proposed by space-time cosmologies. This modern debate began with Einstein when he introduced the block universe and the notion that the unique present is really not so unique after all. And I know you're familiar with all those details. And I know that you're also familiar with the fact that there's been a lot of sensationalism. On the one hand, that time is dead, and that it's an illusion, the universe is static, and at the fundamental level, it doesn't exist. But on the other side, we have a few physicists who believe, and philosophers, who believe that time is real, as Smolin does, and that if you modify the block universe, let it evolve, it'll provide a flow of time, something dynamic. Well, what I have here is a classification of all these subjective experiences of the flow of time, but their corresponding objective experiences. And we tend to focus on just the subjective ones, but each one of them has its corresponding objective experience that if we don't perceive it, we have the potential to perceive it. And that will help elucidate the debate and how to resolve it. Now, Jim Hartle in 2005 attacked this problem by introducing what he called the IGA, the Information Gathering Utilizing System, a robot that it processes information and creates its own version of the present and experience of the present. So basically what you have here on the right is you have some incoming information going from one memory module to the other, P0 to P1, etc., coming up to the unconscious module, across the schema to the consciousness module, and then exiting as behavior. And there are many ways he told us that you could design this robot. And because each and every one of these robots conformed with the physics as we all understand it, there was no unique present, and this was the proof. And he recommended we could test it. One of the robots he suggested was the split screen robot, in which the robot would have, and that could be us in principle, two screens, a split screen, where you can see a little bit of the present, at the same time a little bit of the immediate past, and you could maneuver with it quite easily. On the other hand, it was never created, but it was a potential model of a different kind of present. Well, a couple of years ago, Ryan Smith, quantum physicist at Cal State East Bay, and a couple of us undertook this mission to create it. Here you see Professor Smith with the virtual reality apparatus. The information is collected by the computer. These are base stations, basically GPS units to figure out where everything is in front of you. And so when he pressed the button, it allowed him to go back 30 seconds, a minute, even possibly 2 minutes, depending on how much information you accumulate, and get the experience, and I mean a vivid experience, of being in the past. And he was able to go back and forth. You could go back and forth from the present to the past, ad lib. Unfortunately, the SS robot, we could not build. The brain doesn't want to simultaneous experiences like that, but it does tolerate going back and forth intermittently, which is called the IB robot. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there's an even deeper illusion pointed out by U. Price, actually. And if you recall, when Einstein dealt with his block universe, he said that Besso, who had died, was still there. He called Besso's wife to console her. His best friend is still there, implying that Besso's not persistent. There are many Bessos. Now, philosophers take a little different view of that, saying we can still save persistence if we introduce, as Balashov did, a persistent worm, put all these little space-time points together and say in effect that we're persistent. But this becomes more a matter of semantics. The interesting thing, when we went back to the observer with his VR apparatuses and let him go back and forth from the present to the immediate past, and let him look at a toy dog walking around the floor, is that when he went quickly back to the present after looking at the past, the dog is suddenly there. And the only way to reconcile this sudden change in location is to take the position that the dog is not persistent, that there's more than one dog. So that tells you a lot about the meaning of persistence. So that's the first strata of these components. That is, on the one hand, we experience a moving present. On the other hand, we have the potential to experience a non-unique present. Let's go to movement and motion. Christoph Koch and Francis Crick a number of years ago introduced this continuous wagon wheel illusion to demonstrate that visual perception is discrete. The going back and forth of the continuous wagon wheel suggested that we really see the world at about 10 to 12 hertz, and that motion is illusory. It's sort of painted on like a cerebral add-on, and Buonamano discusses the difference between illusions and cognitions in this regard. And what's interesting about it is that if a person gets an infarction to area V5 of the visual cortex, they can lose the motion without losing the movement. And here's what I mean by that. This is a bird in flight at about 10 hertz. You experience the movement, but you don't see the continuous motion. And what it's saying is that we still get the same information, basically, without that aesthetic addition of motion. That also brings us to completed movement. So now when the interval between stimuli becomes even greater, as you see here with a bed that's now rotated 90 degrees, this is the way these experiments are done. They rotate the bed quickly with a small ISI of a half a second, and they start increasing. And when you have these prolonged intervals get up to 3 seconds, you no longer see motion. You certainly don't see motion, and what you get is completed movement. Completed movement. Now, the thing is about motion and movement is that motion makes certain assumptions. That is continuity, and that continuity implies it's the same object. Whereas movement doesn't make any assumptions, whether the movement is experienced by an IGUS robot, a machine, or even us. There's an object at every point in space-time, and it's conceivable that the object is not the exact same one at that moment. So that completes the second strata. On the one hand, we experience this dynamism of change in motion. On the other hand, we can and do occasionally experience the completed change and the completed movement. That brings us to the third strata of order in the era of time. Now, for physicists, the easiest way to deal with this quickly is to talk about, on the one hand, you have asymmetry, sort of an order of time that Ravelli talks about, a narrative of events. Think of an asymmetry of a cone. Everything is sort of, there's a direction to things in that it's laid out, but it's not scanned. It's not dynamic. There is non-simultaneity there. The events can be separated. So if your cone is full of galaxies, they will be separated. It's as if, with tongue-in-cheek, time is what keeps everything from happening at once. But that's all very different from directionality. Directionality is the movement part, the arrows of time, whether it's thermodynamic, whether it's cosmological, or even whether it's the evolving block universe of Ellis, where you have the block growing, so to speak, and moving in that direction. These are all what many would argue are cognitive phenomena. Now, when it comes to temporal order, let's look at that specifically. You have two types. Episodic, which is when the observer has a presence in the memory of the before-after event. So the graduation party clearly followed the graduation ceremony and its experience. That's an episodic temporal order. That belongs under the category of directionality, or the arrow of time. That's in contrast to semantic temporal order, when the observer has the knowledge of the remembered event, like World War I following the Civil War. And so semantic temporal order is really part of the order in physics that Ravelli describes. Here's an example of episodic temporal order becoming semantic temporal order. Normally, if a person runs a red light, they know that the light came on before they entered the intersection. But if for some reason there's a collision, they have a little amnesia for that event, they know the events, but they don't recall exactly when they entered that intersection and what came first. But if there's a video camera on the top of the traffic light pole, they get the knowledge of the fact that they did in fact enter the intersection before the red light went on, and that's their semantic memory of it. So they have semantic temporal order and lost episodic temporal order. There's one interesting example of it happening from a cerebral infarction to the bilateral anterior fornix in a 51-year-old female who knew very well that a major earthquake had occurred in Japan in the previous year and that a major international airport was open nearby 2 years earlier. But she couldn't decide which event occurred first or second. She didn't have an episodic temporal order, but she timed the events. She had time tagging, which is what is done, and so she did have semantic temporal order. That prompted us to do a study of what's called the semantization of perception of temporal order. It's a trained experiment to demonstrate that episodic temporal order is precludable. So here we have a toy train with a number of objects around. The train passes one. The observer notices what is passed first, what is passed second. And the way it's done is so that the observer only gets a small glimpse once in a while. And in between those glimpses, which are about half-second duration, there are 3 seconds of text. Just indicate something nondescript about the event, such as the train passed a woman wearing a red hat. And what would happen, the purpose of this was to create what is in effect a pictorial book, which we know evokes semantization, not episodic memory. And so the control for this was to have the same series of images of the train moving around, but the interstimulus interval was filled with blanks, no text, no ability to semanticize it. And as you might imagine, when the text was in there to semanticize it, almost all the participants experienced semantic temporal order. The forced choice question was, I did see it happen, or I did not actually see it happen, but I know it did. And that's how we knew, and not surprisingly, that episodic temporal order could be precluded. So that completes the third strata, where on the one hand we have temporality, episodic temporal order. On the other hand, we do experience the actual order of events, as I indicated. Lastly, I'd like to share with you a Gedanken scenario. This is taken from George Gamow's concept of how we can express the problems in physics when we can't really go to the lab. So here we have Dr. Hamron being on trial for killing a scientist who claimed that consciousness is not a science. And eyewitnesses on the stand claiming he saw the stabbing. And the attorney says, "You say you know Dr. Hamron committed the act." Well, yes. "Is it not true that you had a mild stroke to V5 visual cortex 2 years ago, resulting in cinematographic vision?" "Yes, but..." "Can you be positive then that the Dr. Hamron who picked up the knife is the same Hamron who pushed it into the chest?" "Well, although I'm not the same person I was then or in college, I do see everything clearly, more like a Charlie Chaplin movie. And is it not true that you had a second mini stroke to the anterior fornix last year?" "Yes, yeah, but, well, please tell the jury what that stroke did to you." "Well, I do function normally. I see events and I know I'm there. And although I cannot experience which event comes first and which second, I just know it. So, did the stabbing of the victim immediately follow Dr. Hammeron's picking up the knife? I think so. It must have happened. I remind you, you are under oath. I didn't actually see the knife plunging the chest before it was picked up from the table. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I rest my case.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Deiss. I'll be talking to you for the next 20 minutes or so about time and consciousness. But before we start, I just want to take a moment and thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation in this concurrent session. This is a great event, the 2020 Science of Consciousness Reboot Online. The title of my talk is Time or Consciousness Real? It's about time we were careful what we reify. My email address is on the left here, and I'm a neuromorphic engineer at UC San Diego. Our group is in bioengineering, and my PI is co-director of the Institute for Neurocomputation, housed in the Supercomputer Center, which you see here in this picture. We analyze the brain at the molecular level on up to the whole brain, using mathematical models, software models, custom electronic circuits, circuit boards that we design, and whole systems of circuit boards for large emulations. We also do experiments monitoring brain activity while people perform tasks or move about. And some of us are designing integrated circuits for prostheses, like a retinal implant, or circuits that would be placed on the surface of the brain for measuring brain activity for diagnostic purposes. I, in tongue-in-cheek, call my theory a theory of everything else. There's three parts to my talk. The first part is called the physics of everything, where I talk about relativity, space-time, and gravitation, the standard model of particle physics, talk about particles and fields. The second part of the talk is mostly about metaphors, especially inertia and clocks, how we conceive of clocks. So there's generalized inertia, an important concept. There's useful but misleading metaphors. There's the concept of law enforcement in physics. There's cyclic events we use to make up clocks that define time for us. Consciousness is a fundamental process, is where I'm headed with this talk. Events leave persistent records. Consciousness uses and creates records. And I'm going to provide a recursive view of consciousness. Most of us with a career in science got our first dose in high school chemistry, where we learned how everything was made from a few dozen elements, and those in turn of protons, neutrons, and the electrons that give them their properties. The properties that recur in groups such as metals, noble gases, etc. This is about how old I was when I got particle fever, studying physics every which way I could. Later in college physics, we were introduced to Einstein's theories of special and general relativity, as taught early in most science and engineering curricula. Special relativity was inspired by realizing that laws of nature should be the same for everyone, regardless of relative motion. This then required a different way of thinking about time, light, mass, and length, such that people might not agree on what they see, but they will agree on Maxwell's equations that govern electromagnetism. Einstein's general theory of relativity followed from applying the same insight to gravitation, after realizing that falling objects need no gravitation, leading him to the principle of equivalence. He was also the first to explain the quantum nature of the photoelectric effect. But then there was a complication. Electrons also behave like waves in the famous double-slit experiment. It continues to baffle physicists. In fact, all particles seem to like waves most of the time until they interact with other particles in discrete and punctate quantum events. Physicists have been taking nature apart ever since all this was discovered, using ever larger particle accelerators and detectors like the LHC, Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. Two of its detectors are depicted here. The first is the CMS detector on the upper right, weighing in at 14,000 tons, compact muon solenoid. Also, the Atlas detector stands for a toroidal LHC apparatus weighing in at 7,000 tons. These are housed in 6-story buildings, most of which is underground. 3,000 bunches of protons, each with billions of protons in the bunch, circulate the 27-kilometer ring of the LHC 11,000 times per second. They cross paths 40 million times per second in interaction regions. The CMS detector is at one of those regions. It detects about 600 million collision events per second. A trigger pipeline filters out all but 100,000 of those events and sends them on to 1,000 processors that further filter things down to about 100 significant events per second, each being about 6 megabytes of data. They do that every second while running, and all 4 experiments combined send about 25 gigabytes of data to the processors to analyze. The processors end up storing about 1 gigabyte per second on tape, and then they share it worldwide, which, by the way, the fellows at CERN developed the World Wide Web to ease their needs for experiment collaboration. So here's what these LHC and other experimental facilities like SLAC, Fermilab, Brookhaven National Lab, and so on have been finding. Everything in daily life is made up of 2 quarks and held together by a few kinds of gluons. Plus there's the electrons, photons, and the Higgs for mass. But you'll notice there's a total of 17 particles in the standard model, plus their antiparticle partners. Plus there are many other very short-lived decay products seen in the collisions. These kinds of particles are categorized as fermions, leptons, and force and mass producing bosons. In addition, supersymmetric theory suggests there is a host of not yet detected and much more massive supersymmetric superpartners for each of those prior particles you saw. They call these sparticles, the large ones in the background. These fall in similar categories of squarks, leptons, gauginos, and Higgsinos. None of these has ever yet been detected, though people are looking for them actively. Physicists have gravitated to the view that not only are interactions between particles quantized, but also the fields they reside in, the so-called second quantization. For each particle, there's an associated field, such that it is a soliton-like moving bump of energy in the field. Fields can interact, transferring energy between them in certain systematic but not completely predictable ways. For electricity and magnetism, Feynman pioneered a way to diagram events seen on the left. This represents the theory of quantum electrodynamics. Later, a sister theory called quantum chromodynamics on the right. This was developed to explain the interactions of quarks and gluons inside the nucleons, the proton and neutron. The lower left color diagram illustrates quantum chromodynamics. It was named the color force for mnemonic value. On the lower right, you can see a snapshot from a computer simulation of what is theorized to be happening at the infinitesimal Planck scale in the vacuum of space in its ground state. It's a teeming cauldron of virtual particles resulting from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And sometimes a pair of them will pop out where they can be detected before they annihilate and disappear again. I'm not sure of the origin of this formula. I've heard it credited to more than one person, and well, it should be. It seeks to summarize everything known about the types of matter, fields, and forces that act between them, along with the four-dimensional theater of space and time where these players act out. It doesn't have much to say yet about dark matter, dark energy, nor how the universe inflated faster than the speed of light shortly after the Big Bang. If you're mathematically inclined, there are tons of free web resources to walk one through the math both conceptually and rigorously. If you're not mathematically inclined or just bored with it, and if you can at least count to 27, you can give your friends pause with an associated t-shirt. But I suggest you don't pause too long or you might be asked to explain it. Spoiler alert, check Amazon first. You might find a cheaper one, as well as the fact there's a fitting equation for everyone. I'm very interested in inertia. I find that there are three kinds. Physical inertia is as depicted in these top two pictures. On the left, you see someone trying to move an enormous rock that has inertia and requires force to get it moving. On the right, you see something that's already moving, and part of it, the motorcycle comes to a sudden stop at the barrier, but the motorcyclist keeps going because things in motion want to continue moving unless the force acts on them to stop them. There's also generalized inertia. That's a concept I've been playing with. Why do things resist change in the first place, any kind of change? And why only in certain ways? The third kind of inertia is mental inertia of metaphors. Einstein was well aware of this. He said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. An example, metaphor number one, comes from Minkowski. He said, henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. Einstein was not real impressed when he first heard this. As Sommerfeld notes, when later on Minkowski built up the special theory of relativity into his world geometry, Einstein said on one occasion, since the mathematicians have invaded the theory of relativity, I do not understand it myself anymore. But soon thereafter, at the time of the conception of the general theory of relativity, he readily acknowledged the indispensability of the four-dimensional scheme of Minkowski. I think maybe he caved too soon. Since Minkowski's grand declaration, a kind of reification of geometry, physicists have been mesmerized by the 4D picture of space-time due to its utility for making relativistic predictions. The speed limit of light does not require the reification of space-time geometry. It just represents a proportionality constant that all can agree on to get the same experimental results in their local reference frame. Another metaphor that really bugs me is about laws of physics. Victor Stenger notes that many lay people think of the laws of physics as something like the Ten Commandments, rules governing the behavior of matter imposed by some great lawgiver in the sky. And many physicists talk that way. However, no stone tablet has ever been found upon which such laws were either naturally or supernaturally inscribed. On the contrary, the laws of physics are human inventions, mathematical formulas that quantitatively describe the results of observations and measurements. This is contrary to Plato's realm, and there truly are still a bunch of physicists and mathematicians who still think that they're discovering things that are actually out there somewhere. The layman's view of where the law of physics came from is summarized in this t-shirt stencil. We need new metaphors for understanding nature. We live by metaphors. We think in representative analogies, icons, if you will, such as Don Hoffman has talked about. Some come from our embodied experience, and some from cultural training. Consider electron-positron annihilation. They do not annihilate because of a law. Rather, they are defined by such behavior. Their behavior is consistent by definition, allowing us to make generalizations. These are not laws. They sense surrounding fields, and given their state, they then react to the fields. They do not have enough internal state to allow in learning and anticipation, which enables higher or self-awareness. Nature is what it is, and it just does what it does. So it is also for us. A corollary is we need to rethink causality as a metaphor, but I'm not going to try that today. What good results from changing the law as a metaphor? Well, a great deal, I think. The hard problem, defined by David Chalmers, the hard problem of consciousness, is deflated. If the most fundamental elements of nature, imagined as particles or solitons moving about in quantum fields, are sensing other agents, guided and updating intrinsic state memory, then each is an elementary process isomorphic to a conscious brain process, which will be clarified in a moment. This does not imply self-awareness or conscious deliberation or free will in the particles. Those are all red herrings, because even higher living systems can be conscious without self-awareness. And we humans experience decisions hundreds of milliseconds after they are made. I claim consciousness and time both supervene on memory. I have a working definition of consciousness that'll make this clearer. Conscious experience is a process of interpretation of sensation patterns using memory. And then the interpretation is held in memory so that we can infer the meaning of the situation and act appropriately. We build and update models of the world and of our bodies that we reference, allowing extrapolation into the future. Memory is for prediction. It evolved to enhance mobility and predator avoidance. So that definition relates back to what I was saying about particles and acting out their nature. Making a measurement always requires making a record and doing a comparison, even if only within our own memory. This implicitly requires an attribution of simultaneity, or assumption that nothing has changed since the first comparand was noted, a kind of generalized inertia again. Without event inertia making records, there's no time. Inertia is the basis of memory. Inertia reduces time to an integral over changes. So what is a memory record? The short answer, everything that persists. Sabadini has shown how the wave equation before and after a measurement is consistent when one takes into account the persistence of information in a form of a record or imprint of the measurement. There is neither a collapse nor many worlds. What this implies is that something acquires inertia to become a statewise stationary record to pause or slow the changes. It forms the basis for a comparison of before and after a measurement. The second law tells us that changes tend to disorganize structure, enclose systems that might otherwise channel energy to do work. The second law is memory destruction by dilution of structural inertia. Now I'm going to go out on a limb and make some suggestions. And I'm feeling a little bit like the Cheshire cat up a tree here. About that Higgs. The Higgs field interacts with all others so far in the manner predicted by the Standard Model, according to the ongoing LHC experiments. The Higgs field interacts with all particles that have rest mass. Now here's some conjectures worthy of discussion, if not experiment. Does the Higgs or any of its to-be-discovered siblings, if any, slow down other state changes, not just producing rest mass, but say slowing down cosmic ray decay so that the lifetimes are longer as they're coming towards the Earth, or slowing down the interactions and the scattering experiments going on inside these detectors? Does the Higgs field slow entropic processes, thus preserving structure? Is the overall Higgs field intensified near large masses? If so, could it increase the inertia of passing objects, slow their clocks, thereby create fictitious gravitation without the need for gravitons or bent space-time? Whether you agree or disagree about these Higgs conjectures, I hope you agree that conscious systems achieve internal state milestones by sensing, interpreting, and acting conditioned on state, their memory state, and then their memory state is updated. Subsystem structures support the consciousness processes above them. They're all conscious, all the way down. This is a recursive view of consciousness. You can visualize this theoretical approach as a structure using this intuition pump. So is this a real inertial theory of everything else? Well, hardly, not so fast, pun intended. Clocks are relatively consistent, integrated cyclic event records. We sum up a sequence of events and we give it a name, delta T. Each tick of the clock is an event we hold in memory long enough to compare records that are enabled by inertial persistence. Events are changes that require sensing and inertia without governing laws at all levels. Life evolves in orderly ways to gain and maintain complexity using energy to achieve and maintain inertial milestones as open systems. The conscious brain is a key example of the process of sensation and memory building utilized to do adaptive agent prediction and control. Elementary particles have intrinsic agency as well, helped by the record-preserving effects of the Higgs, but lacking our memory complexity. Non-locality is a phenomenon that suggests that space might also be due for a metaphor overhaul, but there's no way I can go into that today. Here are a few relevant references for you. Special thanks to Shantina Sabadini for helping me understand his Persistence of Information paper. It's quite a read. I highly recommend it. And I thank you all for your time and patience. I hope you have an excellent week of consciousness reboot. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Jürgen Kornmeier. I'm neuroscientist at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health in Freiburg, Germany, and I'm also associated with the University of Freiburg. I want to talk to you about using the perceptual past to predict the perceptual future influences the consciously perceived present. If you look at this figure, the famous Necker cube, it's a nice example of an ambiguous figure. You may perceive it either like this or like that. The image on your retina evoked by the Necker cube is in principle compatible with infinitively many interpretations, and here are only some of those. Interestingly, the perceptual system decides for these two guys and ignores all the other possibilities. This tells us something principal about the perceptual system, namely the information available to our senses is incomplete, a priori incomplete, noisy, and to varying degrees ambiguous. And this incomplete sensory evidence is weighted with perceptual memory in order to construct the most probable, stable, and reliable percepts. And 90-degree angle interpretations are simply more probable than stranger geometric objects that are in principle also possible. In principle, we see what we already know. This is the famous German goalkeeper Manuel Neuer, and he's only able to catch this ball because he has predicted the trajectory of this ball beforehand, before the ball hit his hand. This tells us something else about the perceptual system, namely, most of the sensory inputs stay unchanged from moment to moment, and thus making predictions about the perceptual future based on the current percept and regularities in the immediate perceptual past may be a beneficial strategy to overcome the perceptual problem. Predictive coding theories about visual perception go into further detail about this. The research questions for the study I want to present you now are twofold. The first question is, does making predictions about the perceptual future already influences the perception of the present? This means if we have a strong idea about what happens in the future, does this influence how we see the world at the current moment? The second question is the perceptual experience, the direct experience of past regularities necessary to generate predictions, or is the abstract knowledge about these regularities sufficient? Let's go to experiment 1. We used Necker lattices, which are an extension of the simple cube. They look a little bit like an IKEA shelf. On the left you see the ambiguous variant, on the right you see the two most probable interpretations of the ambiguous Necker lattice. And we presented them in pairs. One observation sequence consisted of presentation of stimulus 1, a blank screen in between, and then presentation of stimulus 2. And these observation sequences were repeated many times within one experimental block. We had essentially two tasks. In task 1, participants had to indicate their current percept of stimulus S1. And task 2 was related to stimulus 2. They had to compare the percept of stimulus 2 with the previous percept stored in their immediate memory about stimulus 1. They had to press a key to indicate either stability over time or a change in percept. Keep in mind that for processing of stimulus 1 and for execution of task 1, stimulus 2 was completely unnecessary. Okay, we had essentially two experimental conditions. In condition AA, both S1 and S2 were ambiguous. In condition AU, only S1 was ambiguous while S2 was unambiguous. What we did is we analyzed the visual processing and the EEG related to visual processing of one and the same stimulus S1 in two different conditions, namely if an ambiguous S2 could be expected or if an unambiguous stimulus S2 could be expected. We were interested in whether S1 was processed differently with different expectations about the perceptual future. Let's come to the results. What you see here is a classical ERP trace, or two classical ERP traces. On the x-axis you see time. 0 is the onset of stimulus 1, and the stimulus 1 is present for 800 milliseconds. On the y-axis you see the amplitude of the ERP. You see essentially two traces. One is related to AU, the other is related to AA condition. And keep in mind, the two traces represent the processing of stimulus of one and the same stimulus S1 in the two different conditions with expecting different futures. You see the traces, at least here, start to deviate dramatically. And let's focus on this component here. Let's call it P400 because it's a positivity and roughly 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So now we can ask, how is this component distributed on the head? Then we end up with these voltage maps. Each dot here represents one of our 32 electrodes. And here we look at electrode CZ, which is located here. Here is the nose, here are the ears, here's the back of the head. And the color code indicates the amplitude size. Red colors indicate large amplitudes, blue colors small amplitudes. So we see that this P400 component is roughly distributed at central electrodes. What you see here is a so-called scatter plot. The idea here is that the P400 amplitude in the AA condition is represented here. The P400 amplitude in the AU condition is represented on the y-axis. Each circle is one participant, and let's take him as an example. So he produces in the AA condition about 2 microvolts of the P400, and in the AU condition we measure almost 15 microvolts in amplitude. So the beauty of the scatter plot is that if the two traces wouldn't differ, then all the dots should lie on the diagonal, indicating equal amplitudes in both conditions. Any systematic deviation to the left or right direction of all the points, or the majority of the points, indicates a strong effect. As you can see here, this is a strong effect indeed. So we can say that the S1 evoked P400, this component, is smaller when S2 is predicted to be ambiguous, this condition, than when S2 is predicted to be unambiguous, this condition. Let's have a look at reaction times. So we also measured reaction times for task 1, which means reporting the percept of stimulus 1. And the reaction times are obviously shorter in the AA condition than in the AU condition. You can see this also on the scatter plots. And we can say that the task 1 related reaction times are slower when S2 is predicted to be unambiguous than when S2 is predicted to be ambiguous. So let's summarize. The P400 ERP component evoked by one and the same ambiguous stimulus S1 varies in amplitude as a function of the predicted ambiguity level of the upcoming S2. The task 1 related reaction times also vary as a function of the predicted ambiguity level of the upcoming stimulus 2. Remarkably, S2 is irrelevant for S1 processing and task 1 execution, and still its ambiguity level has an influence. Keep in mind. So, as a next question, we can ask whether the ERP and reaction time effects are really related to the prediction of a future S2, or whether they are footprints from the perceptual past. What do I mean by that? If you look at stimulus 1, the effect could be due to the fact that stimulus 2 is in one condition unambiguous and the other condition ambiguous. So it can simply be expectation or predictions about the future. But it could also be that the effects are related to footprints from the past, because maybe stimulus S2 from the previous pair is influential on the response to S1. So to clarify this question, we did experiment 2. And experiment 2 was roughly a replication of experiment 1 with some exceptions. It has been done by Kriti Bhatia, my former master student, currently in Tübingen. And you see these red rectangles, they represent experimental blocks where we replicated the previous experiment. You see the black rectangles, these are interspersed, unrelated experiments with completely different stimuli. And the idea behind this was that interspersing these unrelated experiments somehow extinguish the perceptual memory produced by this experimental block, so that at the start of block 2 there is no perceptual memory of lattices from block 1. So another difference between the previous experiment is that we dramatically reduced the number of observation sequences. We only presented 3 pairs of stimuli S1 and S2 within one experimental block. Pair 1, pair 2, pair 3. And the idea is that for stimulus 1 from pair 1 there is no perceptual memory because of this unrelated experiment. For pair 2 we only have 1 memory entry, and for pair 3 we have 2 memory entries. So we can look whether the effect is already present here or whether it slowly builds up across the 3 pairs. Instead of having a direct perceptual memory, we used a symbolic announcement at the beginning of an experimental block. What is meant by symbolic announcement? We only presented symbols, a question mark and an exclamation mark, to indicate condition AU, which means that stimulus 1 was ambiguous and stimulus 2 was unambiguous. And we presented 2 question marks to indicate condition AA, stimulus 1 ambiguous and stimulus 2 unambiguous. So it looked like this. Imagine this is your screen. Then you get the announcement, question mark and exclamation mark. Then stimulus 1 is ambiguous, blank screen, and then stimulus 2 is unambiguous. That's how it worked. Let's see what we found. So let's look at the ERPs evoked by stimulus 1. So again, you see 2 traces for the 2 conditions, and you see that the traces do not dramatically deviate from each other. Keep in mind, these traces were evoked by one and the same stimulus, and the difference is only that the expectation about stimulus 2 differs. So if we look at the P400 time window, we subtract amplitudes in this time window from each other, we should see a distribution about the 0 line if there is no effect, or a systematic deviation from 0 if there is an effect. And you see immediately there is no effect. There is also no effect for S1 of pair 2, and there is a slight start of an effect only for pair 3. So look how strong the effect was in our previous experiment, so it's only a start of a beginning effect. So to summarize, the P400 amplitude effect is absent for stimulus pair 1 and 2, and only occurs for stimulus pair 3. Let's look at reaction times. The same logic, we subtracted the 2 reaction times from the 2 conditions for task 1, reaction times for task 1 from each other, and you see they distribute evenly among the 0 line for S1 of the first pair. However, we already had a strong effect towards S1 from the second pair, and this strong effect was kept for S1 from the third pair at roughly the same strength as we found reaction time effects for the previous experiment. So, no reaction time effect for stimulus pair 1, interestingly, but reaction time effects for stimulus pairs 2 and 3. Let's summarize and discuss the current results. So, the perceptual processing of a currently observed stimulus S1 is affected by its temporal context. What the hell is temporal context? So, I think it's in principle impossible to disentangle influence from the past and predictions about the future. Simply because a successful prediction can only be made if we know about regularities from our past perceptual experiences. So, in principle, the influence from the past and predicting the future can't be separated. And therefore we speak about temporal context, which involves both the regularities, the noticed regularities from the past, and the predictability of the future due to that. So, the temporal context also affects the execution of a related task, not only the processing of stimulus 1. As you can see here, we found ERP effects, we found reaction time effects. And this is the case even if this temporal context, the previous pair and the subsequent stimulus 2, are irrelevant for processing of the current stimulus and for execution of the current task. This strongly indicates that exploiting the perceptual regularities, exploiting the past, and making predictions about the immediate future takes place automatically, because it also takes place if it is not necessary. This means that we may do this all the time. We may all the time in an automatic manner analyze regularities and make predictions. And maybe we even cannot avoid doing so. However, direct perceptual experience of past regularities seem to be necessary, whereas abstract cognitive knowledge is not sufficient. We can see this from our second experiment. For stimulus 1 of the first pair, when there is no perceptual memory, assuming that the interspersed unrelated experiment extinguishes memory, then we don't see an effect neither in the ERP nor in reaction times. We only see effects after a build-up of memories in the ERP for stimulus pair 3 and in the reaction times already for the second pair. So this build-up of memory and the exploiting of memory seems to go quite fast. Finally, this is my last sentence, the observed regularities in the past and our expectations about the immediate future seem to influence how we see the world in the current moment. And this is a very low-level finding, visual finding. It can be extrapolated to cognitive things. If you know you have a medical treatment tomorrow, your perception of the world today may be influenced. So if you are interested in further details, you can read our article, which has been accepted a few days ago, and I'm sure if you see this video, you will be able to download it from PLOS ONE. It's part of Ellen Yo's dissertation project, and I want to thank my cooperators. I want to thank you for your kind attention, and I'm open for questions.
Hello. I am broadcasting from my porch in Moscow, Idaho. Give me 1 minute to get set up here. Those are children playing in the background. So I actually have an audience, but I'm not wearing a mask. They're very far away. My name is Joe Campbell, Washington State University, and this is a presentation co-authored by Kenji Lada from the University of Miami, or it might be Lota, excuse me. Free will is an enigma. There are reasons to think that we lack free will if determinism is true. In that case, it's easy to suppose that our actions are ultimately the result of factors over which we have no control. There are also reasons to think that indeterminism won't help, or might even hinder our chances for free will. These two lines of reasoning provide an argument for free will denialism. Here it is. If determinism is true, no one has free will. If indeterminism is true, no one has free will. One or the other. Ergo, free will denialism. The argument for free will denialism comes in two separable parts, suggesting it is possible to save free will by accepting premise 1, the claim of incompatibilism, and denying premise 2, that indeterminism compromises free will. The libertarian wiggle strategy, adopted by Benjamin Libet and others, can accept that Libet experiments and other findings cast doubt on free will, since indeterminism remains a viable option. Hence, there is still a chance to save free will in light of experimental results. The strategy rests on the assumption that arguments for premise 1 are stronger than arguments for premise 2. We show that in one important family of cases, Peter van Inwagen's 1983 consequence and mind arguments, the arguments are neatly tied together. We then extend this result to show that wiggle strategies won't work in response to denialist worries from Libet experiments. So here is an outline. We plan to describe the consequence argument and mind argument, show that if one argument is sound, then so is the other, provide a determinism independent argument for free will denialism, extend the results to considerations about Libet experiments, and explain and respond to the wiggle strategy. We have a variety of definitions. Most of them are fairly common. We only use the term free willism here to define the other terms as just the thesis that some persons have free will. So we get free will denialism, compatibilism, incompatibilism, libertarianism, meaning what they usually mean. And determinism proposes that there is at any instant exactly one physically possible future. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The classical view of free will claims that free will requires the ability to do otherwise, and most presentations of the consequence argument and the mind argument adopt the classical view. So here's an informal version of the consequence argument. If determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past, but it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. So here is, I'll call it the short formal version of the consequence argument. Van Inwagen's version is much longer than this particular version. He breaks apart the second premise about the unalterability of the deep past, the past in the laws, into two claims, one about the past, one about the laws. And let's look at the key for a second. Let's just look at what the propositions stand for. So P naught is a proposition that expresses the state of the entire universe at a time T naught in the remote past. L is the conjunction of the laws of nature, and P is any true proposition. So we want any true proposition because we want to show that nothing is alterable in the conclusion. So we want it to range over all propositions, so to speak. Now, the initial definition that I gave of determinism was symmetrical. Van Inwagen gives that definition. It was a quote from Van Inwagen 83. And he also gives an asymmetrical definition, where from a proposition about the state of the universe at a given time, together with the laws of nature, you can derive any truth, any true proposition. So it goes not just from past to future, future to past, so on. So, and that just simplifies the argument. So I'm, in general, just sticking with Van Inwagen's strategies. And then the technical definition for NP is P and nothing that any human being is or ever has been able to do is such that if someone were to do it, that person's action might result, could possibly result, in its not being the case that P. Okay. So in the argument we have two derivation rules, and there it is. Pretty simple version. Again, Van Inwagen's original is much more complicated. And along those same lines, for simplification as a nod of respect to Van Inwagen, we continue to use the material conditional and talk in terms of relations between propositions. If it pleases, we could translate the discussion into talk about events and develop a causal operator. I've done that before. Below, we consider propositions of the form E occurs or E is an event. So try to look through the symbols, I think, get the point. So here is an even shorter version that we're promoting. Because, of course, we want a determinism independent argument. So we got to get rid of the assumption of determinism. And we're going to try to directly support premise 3 by what we call something like the unalterability of law-like relations. So let's reflect for a minute on premise 3. So here's one motivation. This is the general motivation that we're giving. It's kind of a complex argument, but it's not too complicated. So let's start by asking, what would it mean to deny premise 3? Right, so premise 3 is, we're saying, motivated by the unalterability of the law-like relations between past events and future events, or between all events, given the laws. And again, we're just using the consequence argument, so we can assume determinism if it makes it easier for you at the moment. Go ahead and do that. But to deny 3, one would have to believe that law-like connections were up to us, that they were not objective and mind-independent. One would endorse a kind of humanism about laws of nature. But then premise 2 is compromised. Right? Why think that laws of nature are unalterable if humanism is true? So incompatibilists need premise 3, but that's all they need. They can support premise 3 for other reasons. So we're not saying that the argument with 1 is incorrect. It's just sort of a proof that has that too many steps. One unnecessary step, to be specific. Okay, so let's talk about the mind argument now. Here's the setup from Van Inwagen. This is just a paraphrase. Consider the hardened thief who is in the act of robbing a poor box. He reaches for the money, and suddenly a picture of his dying mother flashes before his mind's eye. He remembers the promise he made to be honest and upright. He does not disregard it. Instead, he thinks the matter over carefully and decides not to take the money. Acting on this decision, he leaves the church empty-handed. So that's the setup. Here is a big part. It's got two sentences. The first one is going to sound a little odd, but really we just need to pay attention to the second one now, and we'll explain the first one shortly. So let us assume at the outset that the thief had no choice about whether DB, the indicated desire and belief, occurred. For we should sooner or later have to make an assumption that would have the same philosophical consequence. But if the thief had no choice about whether DB occurred, and had no choice about whether if DB occurred, then R, refraining from robbing the poor box, followed, in that case, surely the thief had no choice about whether R occurred. And DB and R here are events, not propositions. But still, that second sentence roughly has this kind of structure, similar to the structure we've kind of looked at. We make some, and I note it says, let's assume. So we're assuming that DB is in the past or something, some unalterable, and some nobody had a choice about it because it previously occurred as the main ideas we'll see. And then that's supported by the unalterability of the past, and then also the unalterability of law-like relations. So we've got a foot in the door, some similarities here. Let's build further. At some point prior to our actions, we're going to kind of explain what's going on here. Our desires and beliefs become fixed, and that fixity, by the logic of CA, transfers onto our actions. Doesn't someone have a choice about whether DB occurred, you might ask? One could have a choice about DB only if one had a choice about the earlier state of affairs from which DB followed, in which case proponents of the mind argument will simply raise their worries about this earlier state until we reach an initial state about which the agent in question had no choice. This is from Finch and Warfield. So what matters is whether the agent was able to do something such that had she done it, DB would not have occurred. But like R, there are causes directly prior to DB sufficient for its occurrence, and so on. By degrees, we can walk the causes of DB back as far as we wish, back to a time prior to the agent's birth, even back to the remote past. So admittedly, with determinism, you get to zip all the way back into the remote past. It takes a little longer with indeterminism, but the end result we think is the same. And so we think you get a mind argument that has a similar formal structure to the consequence argument, the same formal structure. In fact, the same argument. Here's the determinism independent English language version of the argument. The deep past is unalterable. It is unalterable that deep past influences the future because of the law-like nature of the universe. Ergo, nothing is alterable. So let's talk a little bit about neuroscience. I'm not going to bore you. You all know more about neuroscience than we do. What's crucial about the Libet experiments is that you get some results that there's neural activity, this readiness potential that occurs prior to a point of conscious intention or urge to perform a particular action. So prior to the time of some kind of conscious choice. And so the readiness potential seems to sort of bypass our consciousness in this. If you generalize on this, where you get fears about free will denialism. And then this argument can be said to have the same structure as the other arguments that we're looking at, only the second premise is supported by some kind of principle of conscious control, that free action requires some kind of self-conscious control, which is a general assumption that people make, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not so explicitly, but it's always an assumption in these things. And so Libet arguments for free will denialism based on Libet results have the advantage that they quickly get to a state about which the agent in question had no choice, i.e. When RP occurs. So there's a reply. Some indeterministic free will theories adopt the wiggle strategy. Since the laws that govern human actions are probabilistic, we have some, as a quote from Libet, independence in making choices and actions. It seems that the connection between RP and A is alterable after all. Libet believes that non-determinism is possible, where this is the view that conscious will may at times exert effects not in accord with known physical laws. He doesn't believe that non-determinism is true, he just thinks it remains possible given the results of his experiments. Bolliger goes further. He claims that event causal libertarianism supposes free or torn decisions are neural events composed of indeterministic quantum events. So he builds, I'm laughing, but it's really an elegant, wonderful theory. He builds the indeterminism into the free decision. And Bolliger has criticisms of Libet arguments independent of the issues that we're talking about here. Still, I think that criticism applies to his theory, and the criticism is an old one. Dirk Perelman's problem of wild coincidences holds it is too bizarre a scenario to believe if for any substantial span of human history, frequencies of indeterministically free choices should happen to dovetail with determinate physical probabilities. In other words, the odds that human actions decided by free, rational choice would line up exactly with events dictated by independent probabilistic laws is a wild coincidence at best. So here's a final way to look at our conclusion. In a world in which events, this is a quote from Dana Nelkin, in a world in which events relevant to the formation of free actions are undetermined, actions are caused by, but not determined by, the prior states of mind, e.g. desires and beliefs of agents. But in such an indeterministic world, no one has a choice about whether one's state of mind will have a particular result or not. Similarly, one's state of mind, being an ultimate result of earlier events over which one has no choice, is also not something one has a choice about. Thus, since one has no choice about anything that is relevant to the bringing about of one's actions, one has no choice about those actions themselves. This is a slightly different argument, makes a similar point though. So the wiggle strategy suggests a kind of causal efficacy on the part of the agent. So Libet explicitly says conscious will may at times exert effects. Bolliger says the indeterminacy of his theory is relevant to the appropriate non-randomness in the sense that it generates the non-randomness, or procures it, or enhances it, or increases it. So the indeterminism is just not mere indeterminism. It has a kind of costly, efficacious role. So Parabon is simply asking, how is this possible given the problem of wild coincidences? Just to conclude with a final point with discussing the mind argument, Nelson writes also, dB is the only thing causally relevant to the occurrence of R. So more broadly speaking, once we know the relevant laws of nature and the past events, e.g. dB and its causes, or RP, we exhaust our resources for explaining action. Thank you. Here are our references. And I will close up, and I want to thank you all for this opportunity. I look forward to getting questions from you.
Welcome to this poster session of Reimagining Meditation, from the Becoming Framework of Foundational Physics all the way into our own personal experience. I'm Gurucharan Khalsa. I work with the Institute of Quantum Studies at Chapman University and with the Fish Interfaith Center and the Contemplative Practices Center. So today I'm going to look at this poster that you can see up there and take you on a quick tour kind of from the core topic to foundations to the old traditional look at meditation to the kind of results that we can find and the brand new suggestions of how we might bridge this gap between internal experience in our inner laboratory with the things that we tend to measure in the outer laboratory. And how these things work. Is this just part of nature and nature has solved it and produces awareness right from the beginning and through nature, and we also participate in that? Or what is that pathway? So we're going to focus on meditation, but we're going to look at a little bit of the physics. There's 2 other sessions I'm in with Dr. Tollaksen that give you the details on the physics. So here's the traditional meditation. We've got about 1,000 different kriyas and meditation processes in a database. So there's not just one process, there's a lot. And here's a number of books I've written on the topic. So if you look at this old map, this very simple map here, there's always 2 forces going on when you're preparing yourself in a state for meditation and for perception. One is sort of the meridians we hear about in acupuncture, pranas in the yoga system. And then there's a second thing which is called kundalini, and it goes up the central part of the body and has to do with chakras. And these are 2 complementary systems that we're kind of instructed in deep meditation to balance and to prepare ourselves in order to perceive the normal things and senses, but also what we might call extraordinary things we don't expect. So if I look at the other part of the poster, there's a clinical piece where we can tell all kinds of things that happen. Changes in heart rate variation, pain relief, immune system, increases in attention, precision, DNA changes in telomeres. We can show all this because we have the instruments for it. The harder question, and which is much harder to find a measurement that will lead us into this, is what is the nature of awareness itself? What is the idea of non-local connections, and what is it to experience self, not the concept of self, but something different, something called unique self? And where does extraordinary experience fit into this? And here's a few more books that summarize all that. So what we need is a different sense of foundations, deep work. Perhaps awareness is actually a fundamental property of nature. Well, how can it be? And how does that relate to, if there is that process, this idea of uniqueness, self, and the sense of time, temporal holism? So we practice an approach here using Gedanken thinking, sniffing out, sensing paradoxes,
and then finding ways to measure, and then to apply that to develop a whole realm of new discoveries. Thomas Nagel, well-known philosopher, said, well, if we're going to really bridge this phenomenological position, perhaps on the primacy of consciousness, then he says we have to find temporally extended developmental processes. We need to search for laws that somehow, in time, create a different relationship from time to time, past, present, and future. And he put these up, coming partly from the suggestions of Jürgen Harnoff, the founder of the Institute of Quantum Studies. So we need a paradigm shift. Now, one of the seeds of that is actually from Bohm. He was very involved in the idea of the essence of freedom, of choice, of the idea of releasing a potential that we normally don't even see that's enfolded in us. How do we unfold it? And there's much written about that, and there's a beautiful film referenced here that just came out from the Fetzer Foundation. George Sudarshan, who worked with us for a long time and is now passed, says an insightful person lives in two distinct streams of time simultaneously. And the two types of time have their own topology, their own shape and connectivity, its own texture. And in profane time, there's chronology, tick-tock, directness of events, linear time. In sacred time, as he called it, well, there's no chronology, no tick-tock, no sense of a long interval of clock time between occasions. Rather, insight is always fresh, and it comes uninvited, without even a feeling of exertion. That sense of flow and uniqueness is part of our deep experience. Now, the birth of a paradigm takes people. Jeff Tollaksen and Jürgen got together at MIT long ago, and then they founded the Institute of Quantum Studies at Chapman. I also met Jeff way back in the 80s in MIT, and we've chewed on this ever since. So it takes people, and this is the picture of the Institute, over 50 members worldwide with many, many great contributors. And there's a beautiful book that shows the beginning of this story, Quantum Theory, and there's an ongoing journal. Now, this work on the paradigm and these new measurements have put aside this idea that locality, induction, and realism are the way to really understand the world and ourselves. Now, there's a picture here on the poster that shows a kind of a handshake going on between the future, the now, and the past. Now, normally time is thought of as just separated moments along a time, events that come and go one by one. There's no real interaction. They just, like a film, go by. Now, the other view is that they coexist on a linear timeline. So now they're not separated, but they go ahead and you can just run time forward, go from one event to the other. Now, Einstein had a strong position that there wasn't irreversibility and that subjective time, emphasizing now, has no objective meaning. There's really no becoming. There's no distinction, as they say, between present, past, and future. It's an illusion, no matter how persistent. We have different conceptions of time because of this. One is a block universe where there's no becoming. One is presentism, and one is becoming in the beautiful organic way that we exist and we experience. Well, we need a new conception. And for that, Jürgen and Jeff have published, and where each moment in time is created not just a present point, but almost an extended now that is rich because it's informed both by the future coming to now and the past. And the interaction, the dynamics, the way that actually can occur is what's been very strongly elaborated over the last few years. But you might be skeptical, and you should be, because it's quite a claim. So what we've done, and what Jürgen has done, is developed a measurement that can capture that interaction between the past and the future and the present. And exactly as you can see here, there's a way to do it. Sets up a pre-selection, the state, prepares a state, puts it through an instrument. It's very humble, very not disturbing the actual quantum states. And then looking at post-selection, and then following up the correlations that go on. Now, doing that has allowed us to use a bridge between experimental physics, and maybe you can call it experimental metaphysics, and the inner laboratory to notice the flow of time, the existence of free will, and how we get to an actual definite measurement of a reality, a definite one we share. And once we had those tools, many, many things have developed into a whole ecology, from concepts like top-down processes, quantum random walk, measurements like weak measurements, the anti-Zeno effect, weak values, non-local ontologies. A whole range of things has to be developed to actually be able to present and share the results to form a new kind of paradigm. Along the way, we can use those same things in order to sort of, what's a miracle? What's something that you just couldn't find using the old way of thinking and measuring? So this is an example of one of the first ones with Jeff in his dissertation, where he could show that you could take properties and separate them from the particle. It's not really held by the particle. So there goes a Cheshire cat. It goes one way through the apparatus, loses its smile, and the other one, you got the smile. So you can separate particle and properties. So what does it mean to have this dynamic relationship to properties? That is an unusual result. Calls it Cheshire cats. Now, that means for us in the experiential level that we know that there's a way to measure, what we can call strong measurement, the usual Van Neumann measurement, and there's a gentle measurement, weak values, that you don't actually disturb the system enough. You keep it in its whole without reducing it. So we can actually do both types of measurement, and the universe, nature, does these all the time. And so do we as part of nature. Meditation is a way to calibrate to both of these things in a way that reveals this constant dynamic of folding and unfolding, which is suggested by Bohm, actually. And that you see here, a dynamic now where the irreducible top-down comes down, joins the bottom-up complexity, and awareness and uniqueness and free will operate in that dynamic mix, which actually is what awareness is. Not just attention, not just neural-based. When you're with all and the one, you're not really conscious. You're merged, it's gnosis, it's a sentience, I call it. When you're in all the world of parts and the different kinds of complexities, you can be conscious or not of something. And then there's awareness that can hold multiple states and virtualize and actually enact choice that can manifest. So I'll go back to the hard questions. Hard questions are, how are things connected? Particle to particle, experience to experience. And this shows just a graphic of, as we look at things and atoms coming together and entangling and creating very interesting properties. And then there's you, someone meditating, who is perceiving the non-local and the global and the constant arising of different kinds of irreducible wholes, which is possible to sense, not with a signal, but by merging and correlating, bringing this in, as well as the bottom-up normal complexities that we do. Somehow we, as nature does, solves the combination of these in something that we call awareness. In the old way of speaking, it was Kundalini. And so if we go back and we look here at the original small image here of someone meditating, what we find in the map, that's not the territory, but it points to what goes on in many traditions. That there's at least two complementary processes in these maps. So here's the forces of pranas and meridians, too much in the kidney, not enough in the heart, push this. It's very classical in a lot of ways to adjust. And then there's Kundalini, which is always kind of separate. It says, well, if you can balance out all these meridians, if you can get rid of conflicts and constrictions, if you can gentle yourself and fulfill yourself in a nice equilibrium way, then you can start tapping into this other sensitivity. And that one is the capacity, as you go up these centers, to have increasing levels of wholeness in time and space and in the inner experience. So Kundalini is that. It's usually called awareness that develops along with this combination of the bottom up and the top down, and then experienced through what we'll call the unique self. When you live that, when you're aligned with that, we call it the authentic self. This is a key to understanding many, many phenomena in terms of experience and seeing a parallel, at least, in the way that we need complementary ways to sense. So Kriyas that we talked about here are actually state preparations that use awareness as kind of nature's bridge between bottom-up complexity of forces and top-down irreducible holisms that come about as presence that pervades all the parts when you get into the parts world. That's the most beautiful thing that we can do. When all that works, we're running around between parts and holes and parts, like our little guy here. And you can see we kind of go this way, increasing holism from the local and emergent complexity. Well, you have to have a capacity to sense all different emotions, all different sensations, all different channels of that. Often we're very, very narrow, sometimes for good reasons, but as we expand that and don't react and don't get completely absorbed only into that one thing, then we can allow more of the holisms that are always occurring. And we start to sense those as well. When both things are able to be flexible and interact, awareness is a natural growth of that. So it's not just caused from the bottom in neurons, and it's not just floating out in a merger with everything, which isn't so conscious. It's literally a co-creative dynamic. One doesn't exist without the other. Together, they're held together in the reality of what is. So here you go, you're expanding and you go toward what? Well, an ability to come from, to recognize, to understand the unique self that's not just composed from the parts, not just a self-concept, and not a thing. So it's not something that a thing exists. It's something that is recreated consistently and always from the whole of nature and time and the specific of where you are. So it's an expanding form of awareness, a rich stage of now, not just a present dot and moment, but an expanded now enriched by all of time and the extent of your experience. So what we end up with by the time we look at all this and really pay attention to many, many details is we want to know where to look for what we do not see. You know, we can see something, but do we know there's more? Is it unconscious? Is it here? How do we in-tune ourselves to both the obvious things that we can be pulled toward and the things that seem in the shadow or that we can't reach? What is it when we know that if it's signaling, we're stuck within the light cone, we can't send it further? But then on the other hand, there is a type of interaction, a quantum correlation, and a kind of play between the holisms and the parts. And it suggests many things as we look into the neuroscience right now with the braininstitute.us at Chapman, that perhaps in the level of complexity that we have in the condition of our particular instrument with our brain and our cells, that we may actually find some ways to sense things, to correlate, to not just signal, but to nonetheless have an effect, an exchange, a dynamic in time that goes outside even the Born rule, which is fascinating and we're just starting to explore. So how do we do it? We look to tensions between physics and our experience. That's how we started. The experience of time, the different kinds of time, the special sense of nowness and now and what that means, of consciousness, of course, free will, self-awareness. That tension, when we can find those crucial distinctions, leads us like a good scent, a paradox, to find a way to resolve it. Not just to explain it, but to ask, how is that already solving things in nature and in us? And then we can conceive of new tools to go ahead. So we need to know how to look with measures, where to look, following the paradoxes, and how to ask reality, nature, about itself. Now for that we have to develop skilled observer states, both in the physics sense and in the contemplative practices sense. It doesn't mean just be mindful or detached. It means an engaged livingness to it. So we use humble measurements like quantum weak measurements and values, pre and post selection, contemplative processes, and even somatic intelligence by preparing our body to have no conflict. So you can contact me at Gurucharan.com out here near Laguna Beach in California. And these are just the beautiful places I love to go in the canyon nearby. Me teaching, 100,000 people or so, and myself. So I welcome your questions, your communication, and I look forward to hearing all the rest of the presentations.
This is kind of the research methodology that Yakir and I and group have used our whole career. It's called Gedanken experiment methodology. It's famous history, the gold standard of theoretical physics, what Einstein used, so on and so forth. But we have this feeling that it's kind of maybe not as popular these days in theoretical physics. So I give it a plug, come back. We've been using the same methodology for a variety of different deep questions, not just theoretical physics, what the second reader in my PhD, Abner Shimoni, called experimental metaphysics, also what we would call the inner laboratory. Examples of profound mysteries where there's a deep tension between modern physics and the inner laboratory. One is the subjective experience of a flow of time or of a now. Physics says that can't be there. It is inconsistent with relativity. Another deep question is experience of free will. And finally, there's an example of a tension between our inner experience and modern physics, which is the experience of a definite reality. We use a procedure that we call paradoxes. It's the same kind of procedure that Einstein used, a way of accentuating the problem or of accentuating the conflict between the theories. And if anything else, it turns out to be a very successful methodology, but it actually makes it a lot more fun.
And when I talk about applying the Gedanken experiment methodology to these really big questions of the inner laboratory, I mean that we're looking for a very big revolution in our most underlying concepts. And that, we believe, is what's necessary to make progress in those really deep questions about the inner laboratory. Hence the image of jumping out of your current framework or your current fishbowl into something much, much bigger. I'd like to invite you to join our group in this incredible journey that we've been on for some decades. And it caused me to go back and think about the very first TSC conference back in 1994. And I think about my talk and my conference proceedings, and in particular, after the conference, we decided to go on a vision quest, and Stuart gave us a tour of Arizona. And of course, with this unbelievable group of people, we were in constant, exciting conversation, constantly learning something new. And I remember, at the time I was already working with Yakir Aharonov and his group for about 5 years, and so I was really recommending some brand new fundamental tools in physics that we had discovered, and I thought these would be very important for making real progress in these deep questions about the inner laboratory. And even then I knew that these new tools were good scientific theories. They were precise enough to be testable and proven. I knew that I would not be wasting any time by basing my journey on these new tools that we had discovered. And as I look back now, the main thing I want to emphasize is that those tools actually delivered an incredible richness of fundamental discoveries in many different fields, not just in physics, but including even in these really deep questions about the inner laboratory. And because we knew we used this proven technique of the Gedanken experiment methodology, we knew that those would form the building blocks for many greater discoveries. And so I want to put a lot of the rest of this talk in that context of showing how we were able to build this firm foundation, how it just kept growing and growing and growing.
So I'm going to talk about some things that are completely new. One caveat in terms of how we do theoretical physics. So a lot of our discoveries are concerning reformulations of the standard way of thinking about things. This means that at some level the predictions are new. You would only say that the predictions are different if at some point we, for example, if we discovered that standard non-relativistic quantum mechanics was wrong and needed to be replaced at some point in the future. On the other hand, all these different reformulations teach us something really completely new. I mean, it's only a useful reformulation if it shows you something new, something that you never would have discovered from the old theory, from the old perspective. What I'm going to try to talk about today is some new aspects of non-localities. Of course, this has been the whole issue of top-down causality, so we have a bunch of new results on that. Thirdly, we've been playing a lot with the sort of the deep axioms of the theory, of quantum mechanics, etc. By reordering them, by getting a new perspective on these axioms, I think it gives you a whole new framework on many aspects of both science and the deep questions that you're asking at this conference. So I'll tell you some new things about that. The last topic, which has to do about how do we talk about the subjective experience of becoming. So first, a little bit about some new non-localities. I think you're all familiar with Thomas Kuhn. He wrote things like The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and so on and so forth. But one of the things he kind of emphasized was a scientific theory has its way of protecting itself from falsification. There are usually some hidden assumptions in a scientific theory, and it takes a little bit of work to uncover those assumptions. One of the areas that we've had a lot of success in challenging assumptions has to do with the measurement paradigm. The basic paradigm, how do you do a measurement in the microscopic realm? So the usual way of doing it with the sledgehammer, which is called the von Neumann ideal measurement. This type of measurement, that historically, the founders of the theory said that's the best way of verifying the different elements of your theory. But we've invented some new types of measurements, one called weak measurement, and this has to do with more of an ontological question, Schrödinger picture versus Heisenberg. I'll talk a little bit about what the weak measurement told us is something about temporal non-locality. If you start asking the ontological question, like Schrödinger taught us that, well, we should think that there's a Schrödinger wave, or Heisenberg taught us, no, it's something much more abstract. In studying this question, we discovered another kind of a non-locality we call dynamical, which is in the equations of motion, and that's something completely new. Emphasize what's new about these things, I'm going to talk about some things I called quantum mirror. So we all have been taught that, at least in classical physics, the equations of motion are all local, right? If you want to understand a force, you look here and there's a gradient, a local gradient, the potential there, and that describes the force at that location. Furthermore, when quantum mechanics came along, the great Paul Dirac told us that there's not really any big difference between the equations of classical physics and the equations of quantum mechanics. And so the original change came Aharonov-Bohm effects. And you would see that this just shows the Aharonov-Bohm effect. Basically, what we have here is a completely shielded region. These little white circles are completely shielded region. And this is a wave function for a single particle. And you would see that even though the particle can't know what's going on inside there, nevertheless, over here you see a completely different interference pattern. So basically, the way Yakir likes to think about it is somehow there's some kind of interaction between something that's going on inside here, right, and the particle that's outside and shouldn't be able to interact with it. And this also shows up in the double slit. What we're able to discover is a new kind of non-locality in the actual equations of motion itself. So that's something completely new. And this is just part of standard non-relativistic quantum mechanics. It's just hidden there. If we want to understand the puzzle of how is it if a particle goes to this slit, it knows if this other slit is open or closed at some arbitrarily far away distance. It turns out the actual equations of motion are manifestly non-local. There's a non-local interaction in the equation of motion between the particle at this slit and the opening or closing of the slit far away. Finally, the other kind of non-locality I want to talk about is not so much non-locality in equations of motion, but non-locality in time, actually. And so we have this extraordinary situation that here's an orbital for an electron, and this orbital decays in 1 minute, say, and emits a photon. And we have an exactly identical orbital, same exactly way, as identical as it can possibly be, but that orbital decays in 1 hour. So there was absolutely no difference between them in the beginning, but they behaved completely differently later on. And this is what drove Einstein crazy. He says, God does not play dice. So our group has tried to ask the question, well, as far as we can tell, there is playing dice, there's uncertainty at a fundamental level. Why play the dice? Why, it seemed kind of depressing, we started in classical mechanics, we had all these beautiful things, we could predict the future, and then we lost that, right? And so what do we gain from it? What do we get from it? The traditional answer is just, well, stuff happens. Nature is capricious. That didn't seem particularly satisfying. So this is one answer that Yakir originally proposed almost 50 years ago. That uncertainty actually exactly allows quantum mechanics to independently select both initial and final boundary conditions of a single system. This is really different from classical mechanics. If we knew exactly the state of a system classically, its position and momentum precisely, we knew all the interactions that the system went through, we could predict precisely what its later position and momentum would be. On the other hand, quantum mechanics, even if we knew everything in principle, this is what this abstract symbol means, it's a cat vector, Hilbert space, we knew exactly what that initial state was, we knew what all the interactions are, we couldn't predict exactly what the later state would be. So that's the basic issue. So what can we say at the intermediate time between preparing a system in one state, psi, and post-preparing it later in a time t? So here this interaction is meant to represent sort of like a measurement. So that was given by, the main thing I want to emphasize here is that here we have a time evolution that evolves this state forward in time from time t1 to time t up to here. And then we have another thing which evolves the outcome of the measurement at this intermediate time t. It evolves that from time t to time t2, and then takes the outcome here, which is a sub j, and that projects it up to the later time. But there's a very simple and universal symmetry that you can use here, which is instead of projecting this one forward, you can project your post-selection backwards. So that's the usual thing, projecting forward. And in this case, instead of applying that time evolution from t to t2 onto the outcome of the intermediate measurement here, we can apply it backwards in time from t2 to t2. Famously, this was originally thought that there was an intrinsic arrow of time at the microscopic level because of this kind of situation. And famously in 1964, Yakir Aharonov, Peter Bergman, and Joel Lebowitz showed that no, that was just an example of a hidden assumption. It was a human bias that was snuck into the theory because we, of course, experience time in a certain way, right? The past has happened. So he was able to show that, no, it's not necessary that there's this inherent time asymmetry. And that's become known as the ABL formula. Okay. And basically, it led to a kind of a theory in which we could, the most complete description at any one time was something given by what we call a past and the future, pre-selection and a post. So here's your basic measurement, ideal measurement, von Neumann ideal measurement. Here we have the interaction between the meter and the system, and we call this a strong measurement. And the actual probabilities are given by something called the Aharonov-Bergman-Lebowitz formula. If you want to do what we call a weak measurement, it's basically the same thing if you just turn down the volume, right? You just have a lower interaction strength between the magnet and the particle.
In summary, suppose we were just talking about a photon, to take one specific example. So Yakir would say the past of that photon is actually defined later in time by a future measurement called the post-selection. Post-selection is performed after those observations which are telling us about what the past of the photon actually is.
As it turns out, this new kind of paradigm, it starts with the original picture in science, which you prepare the system in some prepared state. We call that a pre-selection. You do a weak interaction, and then you do something later in time. And you want to correlate what happened later in time with the structure of the system at this earlier time, sandwiched in between what we call the pre-selection and the post-selection. And it turns out the kind of reality that shows up this time is, and now for something completely different. And this is what we call the weak value of the observables. So in my PhD, I tried to emphasize that this is really something completely different, and so I predicted all these things I called quantum miracles. Basically, these are phenomena that you just simply would never have discovered from the usual standard way of thinking about quantum mechanics. And all these things have been verified. But the question was, how do we stay within conventional science and find just the right areas in the boundary between conventional and meta-science or philosophy? How do we find just those right areas where we can maybe start to break through it, right? We want to expand the region of what you might consider to be conventional science. Most such attempts are not successful, but occasionally you are able to formulate the problem just the right way. You have a eureka moment, and aha. Aha means, from my perspective, aha means Aharonov's helpful advances. And that's really what the Gedanken experiment methodology uses. That's what we've been doing, and of course, ultimately the goal is that you make a crack in that impenetrable wall between what's conventional science and what's meta-science or philosophy. But at the end of the day, you get to this, which is expanding the region of acceptable science, and eventually it gets funded, and hooray, that's how we do it.
Next, I'd like to briefly go over another stage in the mainstreaming of a new subject that I was involved with. And that is really the topic of getting somebody to pay for it and being able to support young physicists early in their career so they can do this research professionally and get supported for it. So the natural candidate is, of course, the governments of the world. So I did a lot of work to meet with high levels of the government and explain some of the advantages from the new kinds of sensor paradigm. That was a game-changing technique. For example, the introduction of the whole area of super oscillations turned out to allow researchers to break the diffraction limit. They were able to build $10 high school microscopes and make them into something immensely more powerful, something that was never thought to be possible. My final topic, I just want to give you a little more detail on one of those particular efforts. After we were successful in mainstreaming by going from what were just vague ideas in the branch of philosophy and metascience and quantifying them precisely enough that they could be scientifically verifiable by publishing our new discoveries in the most prestigious journals, by getting the most renowned experimental physicists in the world to verify them experimentally. There was another step which somehow I took it under my wing in the business of mainstreaming. As I was doing my PhD with Yakir around the time of the first TSC conference, I remembered well the lessons I had learned from my teachers back from when I was a freshman, a teenager. Teachers like Feynman and Weisskopf and many other greats. They told me that it was almost impossible to earn a living in the field that I love, the foundations of physics. So I wanted to emphasize to Yakir how important it was that we try to keep in mind the idea of doing something useful with these new discoveries. Of course, in general, that was not something Yakir or the group was interested in. They were so successful in uncovering some of the deepest new principles of nature that's where they put most of their focus. So I invested a little bit of my time, and one thing that was first published in my PhD thesis was an idea that originated from Yakir of using this weak value as a completely game-changing new way of amplifying signals. And so one of the first things I did was to enlist friends of mine, for example, one of my physics classmates from MIT who became a very famous experimental physicist. So I spent some time with Paul Quia at the University of Illinois and his graduate students and encouraged them to be the first in the world to test out this idea that weak measurement amplification could be used to see physical phenomena that were previously not observable. And Paul did it and famously published in Science, and then that really started to change everything. And our group, in collaboration with Andrew Jordan's group at the University of Rochester, developed a lot of further improvements. Since our paradigm shift in the design of all sensors could be applied to any physical parameter, we started to measure all sorts of different things and improve the different kinds of advantages that you could get. For example, here's an experiment done at the University of Rochester. They were able to measure angles to incredibly small amounts. For example, femtoradian angle. So to give you an idea what that means, suppose you were in Seattle and then you shine a laser from Seattle to New York City at the Empire State Building, and oops, that picture obviously shouldn't be there. Let me try clicking forward to the next one. Oh no! I don't know how my sister's collection of funny cat videos got in there, but let me try to get rid of that. If you measured back in Seattle an angle of femtoradians, this means that the difference between the two laser beams that are making that angle back in Seattle, the distance between them by the time they hit the Empire State Building would just be a single micron, or the distance of a human hair. And we were able to prove that these new types of sensors could be done cheaper and or break the limits of other types of sensors. I invented this category that I called quantum miracles. Maybe Yakir gave me that word. The idea was, here are seemingly impossible things that you can do with two vectors that it's really hard to figure out how you could possibly jerry-rig it to do it with one vector. And so one was a Cheshire cat separating a particle from its properties. You know the story from Alice in Wonderland, right? She's talking with a Cheshire cat, and then the line I like is she says, well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat, it's the most curious thing I've ever seen in my life.
Well, by pre and post selection and weak measurements, you can indeed arrange a situation in which the grin of the cat is in you have one cat, right? You can arrange a situation in which the grin of the cat is in one box, the cat is in the other box with no grin. Of course, you can't do that with cats, you can do that with particles, so in some sense, it's like separating a particle from its properties. You can have the particle sitting in this box, but all the properties of the particle sitting in that box. Its magnetic field, its spin, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So there's all kinds of, this is just another example of just how strange this, this kind of situation is. We did some experiments to test that. That was very nice. There was another one that you've heard a little bit about called the quantum pigeonhole effect. And here we have some pigeons or whatever they are, right? The ontological question is, are they pigeons or are they not pigeons? But that was another example of something seemingly impossible. Something that hasn't really been, people haven't picked up on in the quantum pigeonhole effect is it really gives you a completely different way of thinking about non-local correlations. It's really, we have a section in that paper where we show that it's actually complementary to EPR. When we were looking at EPR, we're kind of missing half the story. Right? There's some assumptions, rightfully so, that in order to create this kind of non-locality, the Alice and Bob's particles have to be, the non-locality have to be created together when they're at the source. Turns out this new phenomenon we called quantum pigeonhole doesn't have that kind of a restraint. So that taught us something completely new. By the way, this paper was voted as the #1 paper in the hard physics sciences by the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. I think that's the first time it ever happened for a foundation. Something interesting you can say about this whole business of reductionism. This is how we're all trained as scientists. This is very good, seems to work very well so far. I'm not knocking it down, but I'm just saying there's some interesting new things we can say. So here's the usual, this is Jan and Gerhard's picture, which you start off with the local microscopics, and that's where all the causal powers are, right, in the microscopic world, and you build up into more levels of complexity and you get emergent macroscopic structures.
Let's look at those new hypothetical whole to part arrows of causation. That goes from the top level, we call emergent macroscopic structure, and it has ontological causal powers over the individual parts. Why is it that science has always said an emphatic no when it comes to the issue of true ontological top-down causation? There are very strong reasons why science has always said that. Reasons that really rise to the level of theorem. These reasons that science has always said no seem impenetrable. They seem like there's never been a way to get around these particular reasons. However, I believe that the solution that we propose is certainly the first one and may very well be the only type of solution that will work in the situation. So let me give you one example of the deep reasons science has said no. First one is called overdetermination. So if you look at this diagram here to the right, you see that nature matter has been divvied up 3 basic categories. The bottom level, say that's 1 particle. A mid-level, say it's 10, 15, 20 particles. And then a top level, which is a huge number of particles. You could even consider that potentially a macroscopic level. What you see happening here is that we have the usual reductionistic picture from the parts to the whole. Suppose, hypothetically, that the bottom level pushes the mid-level to the right, make it go to the right. And then suppose, hypothetically, that from the top level to the mid-level, the top level forces the mid-level to go from in the opposite direction, to go to the left. So the part to whole is telling the mid-level to go to the right, the whole to part is telling the mid-level to go to the left, and that's a fundamental conflict. And the only solution around this is exactly what we're able to do using post-selection. In fact, you can prove that since post-selection is such a deeply, fundamentally holistic action to take, you really need this level of revolutionary solution to solve the whole issue of holism and top-down causality, in my opinion.
One of the nicest examples of the possible idea of emergence and the notion of top-down causation comes from entanglement. And I remember many interactions with Abner about this question, and he would say, well, entanglement has a little bit of that, but not, don't get too carried away, right? It's still very fully reductionistic. So now we have an example in which we were analyzing the Hardy paradox. It started with kind of a no-go theorem that Lucian Hardy put together a while back, and basically said, because of this paradox, there's no way of having an ontological picture of reality. So I started to look at it using these weak measurements or weak values. Basically what we saw was a situation where These are two Mach-Zehnder interferometers that overlap. If you look here, in this one we have an electron going in, and that one we have a positron going in. So the moral of the story is that this new structure of reality called weak values have a very strange behavior, and that
when you take two operators, whether they commute or not, multiply them together, and then take the weak value of that pair of operators already having been multiplied together, that in general is not equal to one of those two operators, take the weak value of it, times the other of those two operators, take the weak value of it. That's called the failure of the product rule. How we discovered the simplest example of a true top-down causation. And that came about when we were looking at weak values and Hardy's paradox. What is Hardy's paradox? Basically, it's a situation in which you simply combine two of those Mach-Zehnder interferometers, one next to the other, and you have an area where the two Mach-Zehders can interact. And when you do that, there is now the possibility that both impossible detectors, the forbidden detectors, in this case we'll call it D- and D+, that's for a detector that detects an electron, the other one detects a positron, and they both may click. And basically, this is showing you real quickly what can happen there. That means that in order for them to click, they have to go through this overlapping forbidden region. Now, a quick way to interpret that is simply that each Mach-Zehnder can be said to measure whether the other Mach-Zehnder's particle is in this overlapping path where you see that orange circle. Otherwise, if the particle wasn't there, then nothing would have disturbed the electron, and the electron couldn't have ended up in that D- detector, and exactly the same argument goes for the positron in the right-hand Mach-Zehnder interferometer. Basically, each one is behaving like an interaction-free measurement on the other one. And here is the big paradox that, of course, if you have an electron in the left-hand Mach-Zehnder and a positron in the right-hand Mach-Zehnder, and if they're definitely in that overlapping region, then you should have the two electron and positron should annihilate, and therefore it should never happen in the first place that the D detectors can go off. And that's the paradox, and that's why Lucian Hardy was using it as basically a no-go theorem. Before we talk about the issue of top-down causation, I'll just quickly give you the original resolution of the Hardy paradox. And that's something very interesting because it shows how the weak values obey this simple, intuitive, and self-consistent logic. So here's the resolution. We have a situation when we measure weakly the number of positrons in that right-hand Mach-Zehnder interferometer. We find that there's always a positron in the overlapping path. And we also find there is always an electron in the other overlapping arm for the left-hand Mach-Zehnder interferometer. So the problem is, how can there possibly be zero positron-electron pairs in both overlapping arms? In other words, the particles are both definitely in the overlapping arms individually, but they are not there together. And the extraordinary answer is that the weak value or product of observables is not equal to the product of their weak values. Therefore, it is entirely consistent to say that the particles that are individually as individual particles, but they're never there together. And that resolves the Hardy.
One of the results you can see here is you ask the number of particles in the outer paths. You see that there are 0 particles there, when you look at them individually. Nevertheless, those non-particles interact with each other. If you measure weakly the number of electrons in the outside path, non-overlapping path, you see there's no electron there. Similarly, for the positron in the non-overlapping, but nevertheless, there's -1 pair of particles there. So here's a situation where there's a property of the whole. When you're measuring the product of those observables, and they are radiating to the properties of the part. In some sense, there's no part, right? There's no particle in the parts, but there is a whole. The notion of top-down causation. And this generalizes very nicely. Basically, I can arrange a situation where I have, say, 3 boxes and 3 particles. If I measure any one box, no particle there. If I measure any 2 boxes, no particle. But only when I couple to the 3 of them, suddenly we see there's a particle in each box. In some sense, this is a whole without part. Basically, you won't find any subpart of these systems that has any measurable consequences. No correlations, no 2-particle correlations, nothing. No particles, doesn't matter what you couple to. It's not there. Only when you couple to the whole, you start seeing that the whole sort of radiates down to the parts.
Additional work we have done as a result of these papers on top-down causation tell us a lot about the issue of holism. For example, we were able to prove that there is a complementarity between the part to the whole and the whole to the part types of interactions. And I just want to emphasize that one of the themes of this conference over the decades has of course been David Chalmers, who has long taught us about the hard problem. Now, an aspect of this question is whether or not it's even possible in principle to model a system that is intrinsically self-reflexive. That's somewhat indicative of that Escher plot there, but already that gives you a mistaken impression, because there we see two hands, right? This A hand and B hand. You might argue that self-reflexivity is something like that. We would argue that actually you would have to learn how to think about intrinsic self-reflexivity by just having one hand, how that one hand has its own inherent self-reflexivity. One of the great clues from this work on holism is that we've now learned a new way of investigating whole-on-whole interactions. Finally, though I believe we've made some progress on the really hard questions, nevertheless we have also made progress on the quote-unquote easy problems, which nevertheless I believe have still remained intractable up to this point. So by way of an example, even if we were to assume that the entirety of the brain is all classical at all relevant scales, we can still have large-scale quantum effects at scales that are relevant for cognition. And I give you a clue as to how this works. These top-down holistic states that I've been speaking to you about are actually perhaps the most robust to decoherence that we know of in the entire universe. Another thing that Yakir Aharonov is legendary for is that he is a maestro at intuitive thinking. And if you actually look at the current state of affairs in terms of the axioms or the underpinnings of the whole show, for quantum mechanics, these are not at all intuitive.
By analogy, we can look at how we understand relativity. So you might ask, what's so special about relativity? The answer is that the very simple axioms that go into it almost contradict each other. So we have an axiom concerning inertial frames, we have an axiom concerning the constant speed of light, and these are almost at odds with each other. But when you try to make them play nicely together, you see there is a region that they play nice and that you can derive the more complicated aspects of special relativity from that. The question is, can we do something like that for quantum? If similarly, quantum mechanics might reconcile three axioms that virtually contradict each other. So one is non-locality, and the other is causality, no signaling.
Our quest to get a more intuitive and deeper understanding of axioms of quantum theory leads right back to this very big question. Is nature capricious? And that's actually a question that both Yakir Aharonov and his main collaborator David Bohm focused on throughout their life. And incidentally, the Fetzer Foundation just made a remarkable film about David Bohm. I highly recommend it. See in there why it was that Einstein called Bohm his spiritual son and the Dalai Lama called him his science guru. Yakir turned Einstein's question around. Instead of God doesn't play dice, Yakir asked, why does God play dice? There must be some benefit from having an axiomatic structure like that. And once again, by applying the Gedanken experiment methodology to these kinds of questions and re-examining the priority of the deep axioms of the theory, we discovered that, in fact, capriciousness is not at the deepest level. But even more exceptionally, we found that nature gained something very beautiful and exciting by this playing of dice, by this capriciousness.
And so we'll try to do something similar to what we did with special relativity and see how these almost incompatible axioms, non-locality, things seem connected in a way that you would naively think you could violate causality or do faster than light signaling, but you can't. The question is, by getting those axioms to play nicely with each other, how much of quantum mechanics can we actually derive? This is the way that science usually talks about the derivation of the axioms. At the deepest level, we have this kind of uncertainty, the capriciousness, the playing of dice, as Einstein said. And then we have these things like non-locality. Usually we think of that in terms of EPR kind of connections and causality, different aspects of the theory, which seem to be derivative from the deeper thing called the capriciousness, or what Einstein called, why does God play dice? And so it turns out that that was kind of an assumption, right? It's an assumption that should be the prioritization of those axioms. As Abner would always say, they peacefully coexist, right? These are sort of emergent from the deeper things. When we start tinkering with them, basically the idea of, is it possible to reformulate the basic axioms of quantum mechanics to say that the deeper axioms should be something like non-locality and causality? What we were able to do is flip this on its head, and we were able to derive the uncertainty of the playing of dice from taking non-locality and causality is deeper. One of the really beautiful things that happened very early on is Sandu and Danny wrote this beautiful paper honoring Abner, in which they were able to show that by creating a generalization of the Clauser-Harmony-Holt inequality, they're able to show that those two principles don't quite give you the whole structure of quantum mechanics, because the blue ellipse here is quantum mechanics. You could still have hypothetical theories of nature that aren't what we know. The green is something beyond quantum mechanics. We see that you can have a much stronger, basically these super quantum correlations, much stronger Clauser-Harmony-Holt correlations, yet that doesn't signal. So many discoveries come out of this investigation of what's not reality, right? So the interesting question is investigating reality and trying to see how we cross this line, right? How do you go across the line of that's Clauser-Harmony-Holt? There's huge numbers of results that came as a result of that. You see theories that are not reality yet, but you get some insight in going beyond what is standard quantum mechanics. For example, when people studied results in the green region, or even papers that were making statements about what a quantum theory of gravity would have to look like. It was incredibly rich research.
An unanticipated benefit that we might be receiving from all our work on Gedanken experimenting on the deep axiomatic structure is that it appears that for some reason non-reality seems more fashionable these days. And my teacher, Richard Feynman, expresses a typical response from the scientific perspective.
And then there's a kind of saying that you don't understand it, meaning I don't believe it, it's too crazy, it's the kind of thing I'm not going to accept it. The other part, well, this kind, I hope you'll come along with me. You'll have to accept it. Because it's the way nature works. If you want to know the way nature works, we looked at it carefully. Look at it, that's the way it looks. You don't like it? Go somewhere else. To another universe where the rules are simpler. Philosophically more pleasing, more psychologically easy.
In our search for the deep intuitive axioms, for example with the Popescu-Roerlich boxes that we just discussed, it's actually very useful to create this generalization and consider possible variations of quantum mechanics that are not reality. The reason is because when we go back and forth over that line between known quantum mechanics, the blue oval that says entanglement, and we go back into non-reality, we can hope to understand that exact boundary. Why is it precisely that quantum mechanics has just that amount of kinematic non-locality? So I can't believe it, but it looks like finally we may actually be doing something that's politically correct. I'll briefly offer one of many examples in which we have been able to use the Gedanken experiment methodology on the really big questions that this conference has been addressing for a very long time. The concern is that we want to make sure, just like Einstein and Bohm and Aharonov and Abner Shimoni were able to explore the issue of locality versus non-locality in a controlled way that led directly to experiments. We want to be able to try to use all the rigors of theoretical and experimental physics to try to say something that would still be true whenever eventually we are able to develop a good scientific theory of free will, etc. Maybe it takes hundreds of years to do that, though frankly, I'm constantly amazed by my neuroscience colleagues like Amir Raz and his group, but who knows how long it will take. What can we do now, even with so much uncertainty as to what will be a precise model of consciousness, etc.? What can we say now that we're sure will still be true at that later time? And here's one of many examples that we've been able to put together.
These are the eigenvalues. This is actually as if you were measuring a ferromagnet. So those are the possible eigenvalues. That's the state of your measuring device afterwards. This blue thing is what your measuring device wave function looks like if you did a weak measurement. Remember the weak measurement can't tell the difference between these different eigenvalues, right? You end up doing a post-selection, and you may see something absolutely extraordinary, something that's impossible according to standard quantum mechanics. In this case, you see the spin of this ferromagnet 40% bigger than it should be allowed. And it's way out here in the tail, right? This little red dot right here. But you see, it's always the case that that red little spot is always less than the height of the uncertainty in your measuring device. This is crucial. So the probability to obtain these weak values is always less than just the probability of getting them as an error of the measuring device. And this is forced on you by the condition of weakness. Your measuring device has to look something like this if you're going to do a weak measurement. This allows you to have your cake and eat it too. Non-locality in time implies, it demands this kind of uncertainty. It makes it ontic.
So I'll give just a simple example of the kind of Gedanken experimenting with paradoxes that can be done on the really deep principles, such as free will. And we do this in a way that we can have relatively high confidence that what we discover here will still be true, even though we're maybe hundreds of years away from having a fully experimentally verified theory of free will. So by way of example, just after the weak measurement that was performed after the pre-selection and before the post-selection, we could perform another measurement, but this time not make it a weak measurement, but make it a more precise measurement of the 45-degree angle of this ferromagnet. And then it must be the case that when we see this, quote, impossible weak value in the 45-degree direction of square root of 2 times bigger than the maximum eigenvalue, which is n over 2, then it must be the case that we have to interpret that result not as a real ontic property of the ferromagnet, but we have to interpret it as purely as an error of the measuring device. There are multiple things that we can prove must be true for a future theory of free will. To give an even simpler example, what I've shown here is that strictly as a function of one's free will in the future, we have shifted the interpretation of this experimental outcome from being a real property of the ferromagnet to being simply noise, scatter, that is required by conditions on the measuring device due to the weak measurement. With careful control and precision, applying Gedanken experiment to a paradox such as these, we have been able to discover many new things. For example, a whole new concept that we call weak information. Finally, Bohm told us that he was very excited by this discovery and that he regarded it as like his first implicate order.
And then there's the issue of becoming time. In order to even begin to talk about this, we had to solve some deeper aspects of theoretical physics. One of those was emphasized by David Gross. Like David Hilbert, who specified some of the deep problems of mathematics, David Gross said, here are some of the deep problems of theoretical physics that people should address at some point in the future. And one of those had to do with the artificial separation between the kinematic and the dynamical descriptions of theoretical physics. We were able to address this and I think solve it in a new kind of picture of underlying the whole show that we call Each Moment of Time as a New Universe. By comparison, David Albert would always describe this as block universe on steroids. So this in itself doesn't give you a becoming kind of time. It solves things like we can describe the state description in quantum mechanics as Lorentz covariant at the level of the state description, not just at the level of probabilities. It gives us a lot of nice features. It gives us a completely new way of understanding the kinematics and the dynamic. It's a way of describing a new kind of time that we call becoming time.
To quote Paul Davies, it's about time that I'm finally out of time. So for the most part, I'm going to have to refer you to our published literature. But let me just give you a few tidbits on our new approach to becoming time. And I want to give a strong endorsement to Carlo Ravelli's work on this. We're really lucky to have him contributing to this subject. First, the little tidbits. Suppose you started with a many worlds type of picture. One thing to emphasize is that in this branching of the many worlds, there can be no interaction or communication allowed between different branches of the many worlds. So if you follow through the usual picture of collapse, in which even the brain goes into a superposition of seeing two possible outcomes, in this case it's a card that falls to right, then at some point the two worlds start to split apart, even while we are still attempting to have a single unitary experience. And so if this process is allowed to continue, then it would begin to fragment our unitary experience of self. And so it's really a force of the projection of a gestalt, or the action of uniqueness, that's involved in creating a definite outcome, a definite experience. And I leave you with a little simulation about how this new kind of becoming time is actually created. And thank you very much for listening.